I woke up to crying. A young man and woman were kneeling by my bed, calling me mother. That was strange, because I was single and had no children. Then strange memories flooded into my mind. I understood what happened. I was a successful businesswoman, and on the very day my company went public, I had traveled back in time into someone else's body, a poor widow in ancient China. I was 33 years old, unmarried, with a great career and an easy life. But this other woman was also 33, and she had married young and had 4 sons. The 2 people crying by my bed were her oldest son and his wife. I had skipped marriage and children completely and become a mother-in-law overnight. Her oldest son's wife was even pregnant, so soon I would become a grandmother too. My head hurt badly. Outside in the yard, neighbors were gossiping. They said the woman whose body I now had went to her own family's house to borrow food, got hit on the head, and came back bleeding badly. They also said she always gave away her family's things to her parents' side and treated her husband's family badly. I soon learned this woman had a terrible reputation. She was mean, lazy, and greedy. She was unkind to her parents-in-law and her own children. After her husband died in war, she caused a huge fight over his death money, split away from the main family, and then gave all that money to her own parents' family. Now she had come home injured, and the whole village was laughing at her. I opened my eyes and told everyone to shut the door. The noise outside hurt my ears. My oldest son's wife, whose name was Wu Huanyang, closed the gate and the crowd finally left. Now I could see my new home clearly. It was a poor mud house with a straw roof, cold air leaking in everywhere. My son and his wife were thin and wore old, patched clothes and straw sandals, like refugees. My stomach growled. I had never gone hungry in my old life, and now I finally understood how painful hunger felt. Wu Huanyang nervously said she had picked some wild vegetables that morning and would cook them. She seemed terrified of me, flinching at every little thing. I realized the previous owner of this body must have treated her family very badly. The house had only 3 small rooms, one for my oldest son and his wife, one for me and my 3 younger sons, and a main room used for eating. A broken shed served as the kitchen, with a cracked pot that had to be tilted while cooking so the food wouldn't leak out. Soon a bowl of wild vegetable porridge was placed on the table. It was black and bitter, with no salt, and hard to swallow. But when I looked up, I saw my son and his wife staring at the bowl, hungry. I realized this awful food was the only thing keeping the poorest people alive in this time. I pushed the bowl away and said I wasn't hungry, telling them to eat it themselves. Wu Huanyang looked frightened by my silence, but my son said if I wanted them to eat, they would. He split the porridge among the 5 family members. I walked outside to look at the village. Mountains stretched to the east, and a wide valley lay to the west. A river used to run through the valley, but a terrible drought had dried it up completely. Last year, the village had suffered a locust plague, and now this drought was destroying their food supply again. If it didn't rain within a month, there would be no harvest at all this year, and the villagers would become homeless refugees. I sighed, but I told myself I had built a business from nothing before, starting with nothing as an orphan. I could survive this hard new life too. I took a breath and accepted my strange, new reality. Then I walked out into the rice fields to look around. The rice plants were pale and dried up from lack of water, with only a few empty grains on each stalk. Just as I turned to leave, a strange mechanical voice suddenly spoke in my head. Ding! A natural, pollution-free sow thistle plant has been detected. I froze. A strange, see-through panel appeared in front of me, showing a picture of the rice field with a wild plant marked in red. It said this was sow thistle, and I could sell it for 10 copper coins per pound. I pulled up a small handful of the plant, and the voice in my head spoke again, asking if I wanted to sell 2 ounces for 2 coins. I said yes, and the plant in my hand vanished, replaced by 2 copper coins. I couldn't believe it. Then the panel changed into something like an online shopping store, where I could spend these coins on food and other goods from another world entirely. I bought a meat bun with my coins and ate it in 3 bites. Food in my stomach gave me strength. I decided to dig up more of this wild plant to earn more money. It grew everywhere along the fields, since it could survive without rain even though everything else was dying from the drought. While I was digging, a woman screamed that someone was stealing her family's rice. I looked up and saw it was my neighbor, Aunt Wong. She'd caught me kneeling at the edge of her family's rice field, not my own. A crowd gathered to laugh at me. The woman who had come home bleeding that same morning was now supposedly stealing rice too. I stood up and showed everyone what was actually in my hands, just some bitter wild greens, not rice. People usually only fed this plant to pigs and chickens, since it was too bitter and tough to cook well. Aunt Wong accused me of using it as an excuse to steal from her. I sighed and said sadly that my family had no food left, and asked if anyone could lend us some grain. My pitiful look, plus the wound on my head, made me seem pathetic. Everyone was shocked that the sharp-tongued woman they knew was suddenly begging. But nobody lends out food in hard times like these, so the crowd scattered quickly. I picked up my greens and walked to my own family's field instead, where I kept digging under the harsh sun until I'd collected 3 pounds. When I stood up, my head spun. I remembered the wound on my head still hadn't been treated. Getting an infection here could be deadly since there was no real medicine. I sold my 3 pounds of greens for 30 coins, then spent 20 coins on disinfectant and medicine from my strange shopping panel. I only had 10 coins left, so I decided to be careful with my spending. When I got home, I heard cheerful voices inside. I found 4 young men sitting at the table, my 4 sons. The oldest, Zhao Dashan, was 18 and newly married, the head of the household. The second son, Zhao Ergu, was 16 and clever. The third, Zhao Sanyu, was 14 and strong. And the youngest, Zhao Saiden, was only 10, small and clearly underfed, licking his bowl clean of every last drop of porridge. I realized that the tiny pot of porridge had been split between 5 people, and everyone still looked satisfied. This family was truly poor enough to explain why the previous version of me had gone begging to her own parents for money. When they saw me, all 4 sons stood up together and reported what chores they'd done, fetching water, chopping wood, and digging up wild vegetables. I felt a pang looking at them. My oldest son was only 18, an age when someone in my old world would barely have finished high school and still be cared for by their parents. But here, even my 10-year-old was already doing hard labor to help the family survive. Then the voice in my head spoke again, saying it had found some natural wild fern that my youngest son had collected, worth 30 coins a pound. I'd worked much harder digging up 3 pounds of bitter greens for less money. I felt tired just thinking about it. I sold the fern and used 10 coins to buy 5 pounds of white rice from my shopping panel, leaving me with 30 coins. I was thankful this village sat between northern and southern regions, since I much preferred rice to the wheat or millet more common in the north. I set down about 2 pounds of rice on the table. My sons stared in shock. Real white rice. After last year's locust plague, the whole village had survived on relief grain, and no one had enough rice to spare. Even in a normal year, families would trade their rice for cheaper grains like millet after harvest, since 1 pound of rice could be traded for 2 or 3 pounds of millet, and having enough food mattered more than what kind, just to survive until the next harvest. As the sun set, I sat at the head of the table and told my family that the rice I'd brought home was meant as a gift for my parents, the Chung family. Everyone's face fell. They'd always known I gave good things to my birth family, but they never imagined it was something as precious as white rice. They had never once eaten a full bowl of real rice in their lives. The 4 boys looked angry, thinking about how the Chung family took their food and still hurt me. Then I said something that surprised them. Today's events had made me give up on my parents completely. I pretended to sigh, explaining how much money and grain I had given the Chung family over the years, and how when I finally went to ask for some of it back, my own brother had cracked my head open instead. I let my sadness show, though really I was performing it. The boys exchanged confused looks. They'd seen me get beaten by their uncle before, and back then, when they tried to defend me, I'd beaten them for it instead. So today, hearing that I'd come home bleeding again, they hadn't expected any different. They always assumed I'd take my family's side no matter what. I told my daughter-in-law, Wu Huanyang, to cook the rice for us instead of sending it away. She was so shocked her hand shook. Normally, the family only ate once a day when food was scarce, and they'd already had their one meal of vegetable porridge. She started to prepare just a small handful of rice, clearly still afraid to use much. But I picked up the entire bag and dumped all of it into the pot, telling her to cook it all. She went pale. 3 pounds of rice could have been traded for 10 pounds of millet, enough to feed the family for days. Cooking it all at once seemed wasteful to her, but she didn't dare question me and quickly got the fire going. My sons whispered among themselves, wondering if I'd lost my mind or if I was just trying to get them strong enough to go fight the Chung family for money. As the rice cooked, the sweet smell filled the house. I had Wu Huanyang serve the rice water first, in small bowls, so no one's stomach would be shocked from eating too fast after being hungry so long. The boys stood by the table, too nervous to move. Normally, they only got my leftovers. When I asked if they didn't want it, my youngest son Sidon grabbed a bowl immediately, even though it burned his fingers, gulping it down like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. The others followed just as eagerly. Wu Huanyang still hesitated, unsure if she deserved to eat too, since in this family she was always last in line, even while pregnant. I nudged her forward, a little annoyed that she was so used to going without. By then the smell of the finished rice hit me, and my own stomach growled. As I served the bowls, I suddenly realized I'd completely forgotten to make any side dishes. There was nothing else to eat with the rice, since the garden had nothing growing either. So it was rice alone, and that was that. Everyone stared at the bowls in disbelief, like they couldn't believe this was really happening after going so long with almost no food. One of my sons even pinched his brother to check if he was dreaming. I told them all to eat, and they dug in like it was a battle. Wu Huanyang tried to only take a small portion, saying she'd save the rest for later, worried I might still want to send food to the Chung family. I told her sharply that the rest wasn't going anywhere, and she quickly agreed to eat more herself, relieved I seemed to have truly given up on my birth family. I wasn't used to eating so much heavy rice myself, but this weak new body of mine managed to finish an entire bowl. By the end, all 6 bowls on the table were completely empty, not a single grain left. After the meal, my sons were full of energy. Ergo asked if we should go straight to the Chung family's house to demand the 20 taels of silver they owed us, money from their father's death that my brother had apparently kept. The oldest, Dashan, stood up, ready to fight for justice after what happened to me. Sanyu, feeling strong from the food, said he could take on 3 men at once and wanted to go before dark. Truthfully, I wanted to go too, but I knew the Chung family probably didn't have that kind of money to give right now, so it wasn't the right time. I told them all to sit back down. The boys exchanged glances, clearly thinking I hadn't really changed and would probably go soft on my birth family again once my anger faded. But I could tell, now that they'd tasted real rice for the first time, there was no way they'd let me give food away to the Chung family so easily again. Erga leaned over and whispered something quietly into Sanyu's ear. As it grew dark, I sat with my 4 sons while Wu Huanyang cleaned up in the kitchen. Before I could speak, someone outside started shouting insults at our gate. It was my mother-in-law, the mother of my dead husband. She and the old me had never gotten along, and after I split away from the main family a year ago, we hadn't spoken since. She screamed about how I'd wasted 20 taels of silver on my own parents' family and deserved to be beaten for it, and mocked me for digging up weeds and begging for grain in front of the whole village. I walked outside to face her, but she quickly changed her tone when she saw me coming and called Wu Huanyang over instead. She handed over a bag of grain, saying it was for her 4 grandsons, and told Wu Huanyang to take care of herself for the baby's sake. Then she left in a hurry. I remembered that the old me used to fight with this woman constantly and always won, since I was younger and sharper-tongued. She'd come to yell at me but was actually scared of being yelled back at in front of everyone, so she'd rushed off before I could respond. Wu Huanyang nervously handed the bag to me instead of keeping it for herself, clearly too afraid of upsetting me to argue. I decided to accept it. It gave me a good excuse to bring out food without anyone questioning where it came from. That night, we all shared 1 basin of hot water to wash up, since water was scarce during the drought. I washed first, since apparently a mother-in-law here had the highest status in the family, even ahead of everyone else. I actually felt lucky about that for once. But then came bedtime, and I froze completely. The house only had 2 rooms, one for my married son and his wife, and one for me and my other 3 sons, sharing a single bed. I'd never shared a bed with anyone before, let alone 3 teenage boys who technically were my sons but felt like strangers to me. I lay there in shock while they all fell asleep and started snoring loudly around me. I could barely sleep at all, telling myself that the moment I had money, I'd build us a bigger house with my own room. Morning came early with the rooster's crow. Everyone in the village woke up before sunrise to work in the fields. I hadn't slept well on the hard straw bed, and I realized winter would be brutal here. Poor families like ours couldn't afford real cotton blankets, only straw-stuffed ones, and this region didn't even have heated floors like some northern villages. I knew I'd need to find warm blankets before winter came, on top of just keeping everyone fed. I got up and found the household already busy, my daughter-in-law washing clothes, my sons heading out to farm, fetch water, chop wood, and dig up vegetables. They were surprisingly responsible boys, and I couldn't understand why the old me had cared more about her own nephews than about them. I told everyone to wait before heading out. I went inside and opened the bag of millet my mother-in-law had left. It was old, slightly moldy from last year's harvest. Eating spoiled grain could make anyone sick, and I didn't want the kids suffering through that if I could help it. I dumped it out and used my strange shopping panel instead to buy fresh millet, even though it cost more than rice did in that market. I only had 30 coins left, so I spent most of it on 5 pounds of millet, leaving just 5 coins. I brought the fresh millet out and told everyone to eat breakfast before starting work. Wu Huanyang recognized the bag as the one from my mother-in-law, but when she opened it, she was stunned. This millet was much nicer than anything they'd ever received from her before. I told her simply to cook porridge with it over the next 2 days, since I didn't think I could handle eating heavy food again so soon, and porridge would be gentler on stomachs that hadn't eaten well in a long time. Wu Huanyang couldn't believe how generous I'd suddenly become, especially after we'd all gone hungry for so long before. She didn't ask questions, and just went to cook. My oldest son put down his hoe to help her, while the 2 younger boys hovered eagerly by the stove. Only my second son, Ergu, looked a little worried, wondering if I'd completely lost my sense of caution about our food supply. But he decided not to argue. Better to eat well now than let it go to waste, and worrying about tomorrow could wait. Morning came, and the millet porridge bubbled away on the stove, its smell filling the house. My youngest son, Sidon, drooled just watching it cook. I wanted to wipe his face, but realized we didn't even own a proper cloth for that. I decided to just let it go. Soon 6 bowls of porridge were served, with extra left in the pot for seconds. My family ate happily, sighing with satisfaction like they wished this dream would never end. Once breakfast was done, I assigned everyone their tasks. My oldest son to check the fields, my second son to fetch extra water for baths, my third son to chop wood. When my youngest asked what he should do, I told him he'd come with me and Wu Huanyang up the mountain to search for something to go with our meals besides just grain. Wu Huanyang looked surprised. Normally, I never joined in on chores like foraging, leaving that job entirely to her and Sidon. But she didn't dare question me, worried I might think she was trying to avoid work. As we all headed out in different directions, the sun was rising over the busy village. I saw many experienced farmers standing helplessly at the edges of their dried-up fields, some even kneeling and praying for rain. With what I knew about weather patterns, I could tell rain wasn't coming anytime soon. The crops were doomed. Along the mountain path, most of the easy-to-reach wild greens had already been picked clean by other families searching for food. But my strange shopping panel kept alerting me to more. Sow thistle everywhere, and then wild mushrooms hidden under the leaves. I found white mushrooms and dark ones growing together under a pile of damp leaves. Even without rain, the mountain's natural moisture let mushrooms grow in the rotting leaf litter. I gathered them into my basket, and my panel told me they were worth good money, far more than the vegetables I'd been collecting. Just this small handful earned me 48 coins. I felt like my dream of getting warm blankets for winter was finally within reach. When Sidon came over curious about what I'd found, I casually explained that shady, damp spots like this tended to grow mushrooms, and told the group to look around. Most wild mushrooms in this forest were poisonous. Years ago, a whole family had died from eating a bad one, so villagers avoided anything unfamiliar. But since my panel warned me about anything dangerous, I wasn't worried at all. We wandered deeper into the woods. Sidon excitedly called out that he'd found a cluster of mushrooms. Checking my panel, I saw they were a common edible type. I told him he'd done a great job. His eyes went wide with surprise. It seemed like the first time I had ever praised him. I gently touched his hair and told him to keep at it, warning him not to wander off. This was apparently also the first time I'd ever touched his hair affectionately, and he seemed thrilled, determined to make me proud again. I quietly wiped my hand afterward, realizing he probably hadn't washed his hair in a long time, though honestly, neither had I lately. Wu Huanyang and I moved to another spot and found wild fern growing everywhere, which she began digging up right away. I kept exploring on my own and found another patch of dark mushrooms growing under a tree, the same rare, valuable kind most villagers were too afraid to touch because of their unusual color. This was the most expensive item I'd seen yet, worth even more than before. I quickly dug them all up, and when I sold them, my earnings jumped dramatically. Adding it all together, I now had 211 coins, enough to buy about 100 pounds of rice, enough to feed my whole family for almost 2 months. Just then, I heard a child crying loudly nearby. Something about the voice sounded familiar. I followed the sound and found a group of older village boys surrounding my youngest son, Sidon, who was sobbing and insisting a rabbit belonged to him, saying he'd spotted it first. The boys refused to give it up, arguing that since the rabbit was in their hands now, it belonged to them. I walked over, and honestly, I wasn't even thinking about the rabbit itself. I was already imagining all the delicious dishes I could make from it. The group of boys froze when they saw me approaching. Word around the village was that I wasn't someone to mess with, even standing up to my own mother-in-law without fear. They looked ready to bolt but were too scared to be the first to run. I asked calmly what exactly had happened with the rabbit. The ringleader, a boy named Zhang Dagong, insisted they had caught it fairly and that Sidon was just jealous and trying to steal it from them. Sidon, still crying, insisted he'd been the one to catch it first before they'd snatched it away from him. I wasn't fooled for a second. There was no way my 10-year-old son Sidon would have picked a fight with a whole group of older boys alone over a rabbit. They clearly thought they could bully him, since he seemed to be by himself. My smile turned cold. I told the boys that while I normally wouldn't bother arguing with children, they'd hurt my son, so they owed us compensation. I rolled up Sidon's sleeve to show faint red marks on his wrist and his torn shirt sleeve, demanding money for medicine and a new set of clothes. The ringleader, Zhang Dagong, looked stunned. The mark was barely a scratch, and Sidon's clothes were already old and tattered anyway. But one of the other boys quietly warned the group that I had a reputation for making scenes over even small amounts of money, and now I was asking for much more. Zhang Dagong decided it wasn't worth the trouble, dropped the rabbit, and the whole group ran off. Sidon dove forward and caught the escaping rabbit, hugging it close. I used my shopping panel to buy a small tin of soothing ointment and gently spread it on his wrist. He stared at me, looking a little stunned, like he wasn't used to seeing this softer side of me. I could tell he was both happy and worried at the same time, maybe wondering if this was all just a dream that might end. I asked him if he preferred steamed or braised rabbit for dinner. His eyes went wide with alarm. He clearly hadn't thought about eating the rabbit at all. In his mind, he already imagined keeping it as a pet, building it a little home behind the house, playing with it every day. I had no idea he wanted to keep it. In a famine year like this, there was no room to feed a pet when people themselves barely had enough. I picked up the thin, scrawny rabbit. It barely weighed 2 pounds, nowhere near enough to feed 6 people. Checking my shopping panel, I saw wild rabbit meat sold for much more than farmed rabbit in my old world, since people there valued natural meat even if farmed rabbit actually tasted better. Still, seeing how much Sidon cared about this particular rabbit, I decided not to sell it outright just yet. Just then, Wu Huanyang came rushing up the path with her vegetable basket, nearly slipping. I caught her before she fell. She was pregnant and shouldn't have been climbing the mountain at all, especially since we'd never even had a doctor confirm how far along she was. A fall like that could have hurt the baby. I told her Sidon had caught us a rabbit for dinner. She lit up with joy. The family hadn't eaten meat in almost a year. She even offered to skin it herself and save the fur to make me a scarf. At the mention of skinning it, Sidon burst into tears, clearly picturing the process in his head. He was scared that if he objected to me eating the rabbit, I might turn back into my old harsh self and start giving away food to the Chung family again. He decided to keep quiet and let it go, even though he couldn't bear to eat it himself. I reassured him that since he'd caught it, he'd get extra meat later. He only cried harder, silently deciding he simply wouldn't eat any of it at all. We headed back down the mountain. Wu Huanyang's basket was full of wild fern, and Sidon's was full of mushrooms. Mine, notably, was still empty, since I hadn't let anyone see what I'd actually collected. Wu Huanyang quietly assumed I'd just come along to supervise them working. By the time we reached home, it was almost noon. I told Wu Huanyang not to skin the rabbit herself, claiming that blood wasn't good for a pregnant woman, and sent her to boil water instead. Really, I just needed privacy to secretly swap the thin rabbit for a much bigger one through my shopping panel. She looked touched, since I'd never shown this kind of concern for her pregnancy before, even when she'd been doing hard chores like killing our last chicken weeks earlier. She could sense I seemed different now, kinder somehow. Once alone, I quickly traded the skinny rabbit for a plump 7-pound one, even making a small profit in the exchange. While Wu Huanyang was busy starting the fire, I quickly killed the rabbit and tried to skin it myself. Despite being sharp with business deals, I had absolutely no skill with this kind of task, and ended up making a complete mess, blood and gray fur everywhere, without managing to get the skin off cleanly at all. My oldest son Dashan came home just in time. I quickly pulled him aside and handed him the dead rabbit, asking him to skin it since I had no idea how. He tied the rabbit up with dried grass and started skinning it skillfully. I turned away from the bloody sight and focused on figuring out what else we could cook, since one rabbit clearly wouldn't feed 6 people. I wished this world had potatoes, but I wasn't even sure what vegetables were available here. I called Sidon over. He was still sniffling, his face streaked with tears and dirt. I washed his face with a little water and told him gently that Zhang Dagong's group wouldn't bother him again, so he had no reason to keep crying. He tried to hold back his tears, realizing crying wouldn't bring the rabbit back to life anyway. I gave him 5 coins and sent him to our old family home to trade for vegetables, hoping he could bring back a radish for the stew. Just imagining rabbit and radish stew made his mouth water, though he still refused to actually eat the rabbit himself out of loyalty to his lost pet. He walked to the Zhao family's old house at the center of the village, a large, well-built home belonging to my in-laws. Only my mother-in-law and my 3rd sister-in-law were home. My mother-in-law was busy drying wild greens to store up before the drought made things worse. When Sidon explained his mother wanted a radish, my sister-in-law's face soured immediately. She was bitter that I had taken 20 taels of silver and land when I split from the family, supposedly cutting all ties, yet was now sending my son back to beg. My mother-in-law grumbled about how lazy I'd been all spring, never planting radishes myself, while everyone else did, and now my family was left digging up weeds while others had food stored away. Still, she pulled up a small radish, and out of some grudging fairness, added 2 more when she saw how small they were. My sister-in-law felt resentful watching all this. She'd only given birth to 2 daughters and felt like a disappointment in the family, unable to speak up no matter how much favoritism she witnessed, simply because I had given birth to sons and she hadn't. Sidon pulled out the 5 coins I'd given him and thanked his grandmother for the radishes. She was confused. Normally I never paid for anything, having caused scenes to take food from the family without paying during last year's famine. Worried I might come make more trouble, she'd secretly sent grain over the night before. When Sidon tried to leave, she stopped him, feeling he hadn't gotten enough in exchange for the coins and suspecting me of scheming something. She tried to give the coins back, but Sidon refused, terrified I'd punish him for not spending them. Knowing I was known for hitting my children, she instead picked some green beans and grabbed an egg from the chicken coop to send with him. Seiden's eyes went wide at the sight of the egg. In the past, I had always eaten the family's eggs myself, and he used to secretly lick discarded eggshells just to taste a hint of their flavor. Now, seeing me act differently, he wondered if he might actually get to try a real egg this time. He carried everything home, and I took it from him, surprised. He explained his grandmother didn't want me to feel shortchanged, then proudly held up the egg. Eggs were valuable here. Most families saved them to trade at market rather than eating them. Remembering the previous version of me had selfishly eaten every egg herself, even with a pregnant daughter-in-law and hungry children in the house, I felt a flash of anger at her carelessness. Seiden nervously asked if he could try just a small bite of the egg, just to know what it tasted like. I told him of course he could, and sent him off to play while I prepared the food. Meanwhile, Wu Huanyang was cutting up the rabbit meat, puzzled by how the rabbit seemed to have grown bigger somehow since we'd caught it in the mountains. It was easily 5 or 6 pounds now. She asked nervously how I wanted it cooked. My cooking skills were limited to simple things like fried rice, though I understood plenty of theory. The problem was, this house had no real seasonings, not even oil or salt. Since the rabbit was fat enough to render its own oil, I bought a small bag of salt through my shopping panel and secretly added some to our empty salt.
Yar.
I also bought some spices, cinnamon bark, star anise, bay leaves, and casually set them on the counter, claiming I'd found them on the mountain that morning. I stood by, giving instructions: render the fat first, then fry the spices until fragrant. Wu Huanyang didn't dare question where the spices had really come from and followed my directions carefully. Soon, the kitchen filled with the rich smell of cooking meat. Outside, my oldest son Dashan was chopping wood, but the smell of cooking rabbit made him drool. My youngest, Seiden, hovered by the kitchen door, practically drooling too, even though he'd already eaten breakfast that morning. His stomach kept growling despite that. I covered the pot, cracked an egg into a bowl to make a mushroom egg soup, and set aside a bunch of green beans to stir-fry. Wu Huanyang looked completely bewildered by my behavior. Ever since yesterday, I seemed determined to use up all our food at once, like I had no plan for tomorrow. Still, she didn't question it, relieved that at least we'd have something to eat rather than me sending it away to the Chung family again. When I noticed Seiden staring hungrily at the kitchen, I lifted the lid and fed him a small piece of rabbit meat. His eyes went wide with amazement. He'd never tasted anything so delicious in his life. I asked if he liked it, and he seemed conflicted, torn between guilt over his pet and how incredible the food tasted. I gave him another piece anyway, and sent him to fetch his older brothers for dinner. Wu Huanyang finished cooking everything under my direction: the rabbit stew, mushroom egg soup, stir-fried beans, and a pot of millet rice. The small table was now full of food. Dashan could barely focus on his chores, eyes glued to the food. Wu Huanyang quietly asked him if this was really okay. We'd eaten so much rice the night before, and now we were using up everything else too. What would we eat tomorrow? Dashan reassured her that I must have a plan, and she went back to stacking firewood without arguing further. I sat resting in the main room, fanning myself with a leaf in the summer heat, planning to finally wash up properly that evening. Then Seiden came running back, breathless, saying a friend had spotted his 2 older brothers heading toward Chung family village. That was my birth family's village, about an hour's walk away. I immediately understood what those 2 boys were up to. Last night, after I refused to let them go seek revenge on the Chung family, they must have snuck off on their own anyway. I grabbed Dashan and rushed out with him, skipping lunch entirely, walking under the blazing midday sun. The old memories told me the village wasn't far, but with my own legs and used to this kind of walking, it felt endless. I made a mental note that once I had enough money, I'd definitely buy a horse cart, though between blankets, a new pot, a house, and now a cart, my wish list was growing far faster than my funds. When we finally reached Chung family village, larger and slightly better off than ours but still suffering from the drought, I saw something that made my blood boil. My 2 sons, Ergo and Sanyu, were tied to a tree in the yard, exposed to the harsh sun with no water, their lips cracked and bleeding, faces pale as if they might collapse any moment. Dashan rushed forward furiously to free them. The boys looked hopeful seeing him, but their faces went pale again seeing me walk in right behind him. They remembered how, once before, when they tried to defend me against the Chung family, I had turned around and punished them instead for interfering. No matter how badly the Chung family treated me, the old me had never allowed her sons to fight back on her behalf. They'd snuck over anyway, too angry to just let things go, hoping to cause the Chung family some trouble even if they couldn't recover the debt. Now it seemed they'd only made things worse. Would I side against them even more now? My old mother, Granny Chung, stormed out of the house furious, accusing my sons of sneaking in and killing their prize hen, claiming it laid an egg every day worth real money and that the family's income depended on it. She demanded 2 taels of silver in compensation immediately, insisting the hen had helped fund her grandson's education. I nearly laughed out loud. This was rich. Yesterday they'd beaten me bloody, and today they tied up my sons in the sun, and now they had the nerve to demand payment from me. Even in this famine, a hen wasn't worth anywhere near that much money. 2 taels could buy dozens of chickens. And as for funding my nephew's education, that had always been thanks to my own years of financial support, not some chicken. If they wanted to settle scores, then fine. I'd settle every single one, down to the last coin. I coldly told Dashan to untie his brothers. My mother, old Granny Chung, immediately objected, insisting they deserved punishment for what they'd done. Dashan hesitated, unsure who to obey, until I gave him a sharp look and he quickly cut the ropes free, helping his brothers sit down. Granny Chung lectured me about spoiling my sons, insisting they should be left tied up and starving for days to teach them a lesson. I told her coldly that my children were my own business, not hers to interfere with. My old sister-in-law appeared, scolding me for speaking so coldly to my own mother. I told them plainly that after my own brother had split my head open the day before, I no longer considered myself part of this family. As for the hen they wanted 2 taels of silver for, I pointed out that no family treated their own married-out daughter this unfairly. Granny Chung argued the hen's egg-laying value over 10 years would add up to that price. I decided to fight back properly. I brought up the 20 taels, my husband's death compensation, which my brother had borrowed and never repaid. Even subtracting the hen's 2 taels, they still owed us 18. My sister-in-law protested that the money had been a gift, never meant to be repaid. I calmly threatened to take the matter to the county magistrate, knowing my nephew Qingzhao, a promising young scholar the family was proud of, would be humiliated if his family got dragged into a lawsuit over unpaid debts. This threat clearly worried them, since the Chung family cared deeply about appearances because of Qingzhao's reputation. My sister-in-law panicked, threatening that Qingzhao would disown me if I went through with it. I told her I didn't care about that. I only wanted my money back. Granny Chung, furious, grabbed a piece of firewood and tried to hit me, but Dashan jumped in front of me to block it. I stated plainly that if they wanted to fight dirty, we'd settle it in court, and started walking away with my sons. Panicking, my sister-in-law rushed after me, quietly convincing Granny Chung to just agree to repay the 18 taels for now, reasoning that once I calmed down, or once Qingzhao became a successful official, the debt would be easy to pay off, and either way, she had no intention of ever letting me benefit from her son's future success. Granny Chung reluctantly promised the money would be repaid once Qingzhao passed his exams. I smiled and turned to my other sister-in-law, who'd been quietly enjoying the drama from the sidelines. She had no scholarly son of her own, and had always been treated poorly compared to the first sister-in-law. I offered her half of the 18 taels if she simply let me know whenever the family actually had money available. She was thrilled at the idea, and I knew this would only deepen the rivalry between the 2 sisters-in-law, keeping them too busy fighting each other to bother me. Just as I turned to leave, I smelled chicken soup cooking inside. I marched into the house and came back out with a pot of it, handing it straight to my sons. My sister-in-law protested that it was meant for her son, but I pointed out that since I'd already paid for their hen, the soup now belonged to us. My sons drank it eagerly, starving and thirsty from being tied up all day, tearing into chicken legs and wings. Dashan even secretly hid a piece in his sleeve to bring home for his pregnant wife. Granny Chung nearly fainted with rage, having lost both the silver she'd hoped to extort and the soup meant for her prized grandson. She screamed that I should never come back, that I'd chosen to cut ties with the family and shouldn't expect their help if anyone ever wronged me again. I didn't care at all. As I was leaving, I noticed a silver hairpin in her hair, one my late husband had given me years ago, which I'd thought was lost. I snatched it back, telling her plainly that I now realized it had been stolen by her family all along, and I was simply taking back what was rightfully mine. Hearing herself accused of theft in front of everyone was too much for her. She gasped, her face went pale, and she collapsed unconscious right there in the yard. The sun began to set, painting the sky gold over the village. As my sons and I walked home, Sidon and Wu Huanyang came rushing out to meet us, worried. I told everyone calmly to wash up for dinner. The table was full. Rabbit stew with radish, mushroom egg soup, fried beans, 6 bowls of millet rice, and now half a chicken thanks to Dashan's secret stash. My 2 younger sons, Urgu and Sanyu, who'd expected punishment for sneaking off to the Chung family, were stunned to come home to such a feast instead. Before we ate, I had Wu Huanyang fill another bowl with rabbit and radish and sent Sidon to deliver it to his grandparents' house, my mother-in-law and father-in-law. At their home, dinner had already ended, just simple buckwheat porridge and plain cornbread, the usual poor meal for this drought year. My mother-in-law caught the smell of meat drifting through the air and was shocked when Sidon appeared holding a bowl of real rabbit stew, a gift from me. He handed it over and ran off before she could even respond, eager to get back to his own dinner. She could hardly believe I, someone who'd always taken from the family and never given back, was suddenly being generous. The smell drew out the rest of the household, curious about where this meat had come from. My other daughters-in-law were surprised too, pointing out that earlier that day I'd sent Sidon asking for vegetables and an egg, which barely balanced out this gift. My mother-in-law suspected I must be plotting something, since I'd never behaved this generously before. Rather than share the rare meat with all her grandchildren, she decided to keep the bowl for herself, tasting it privately and marveling at how delicious it was. She couldn't believe I'd suddenly become such a good cook. Back at our house, once Sidon returned, I called everyone to eat. All 4 boys dug into the meal eagerly, even usually timid Wu Huanyang eating heartily. By the end, every dish and bowl was completely empty, not even broth left behind. The whole family sat back, full and content. Sidon rubbed his stomach happily, saying it was the first time he'd ever felt truly full, then asked nervously if we'd have enough to eat again tomorrow. Everyone looked at me for an answer. I admitted honestly that we had no more grain left in the house. Their faces fell, but then I placed the silver hairpin on the table, explaining it was a gift from their late father to me, years ago, before I'd foolishly given it away to my birth family. Now that I'd cut ties with the Chung family completely, I no longer wanted to keep it and planned to pawn it in town for grain money. Mentioning their father brought tears to the boy's eyes. Dashan, who remembered him best, clenched his fists and insisted we shouldn't sell something so precious. I gently told him that without it, we had no way to buy food, and that their father surely wouldn't want his own sons to go hungry over a hairpin. They fell quiet, feeling guilty they hadn't been able to protect something so meaningful to their mother. Urgu quietly promised that someday he'd buy it back for me. The mood turned somber, so I changed the subject, asking Dashan to check if a neighbor's ox cart would be heading to town the next morning. Walking there myself would be nearly impossible given how exhausted I already was from today's trip. Sidon, who'd never even met his own father, who died in battle before he was born, felt the loss of his father less strongly than the loss of his rabbit friend. Quietly, he gathered up all the little rabbit bones from the table, wrapped them in leaves, and buried them in the yard, the only thing he could still do for the pet he'd lost. As the night grew darker and the moon rose, I sat down with my 2 younger sons and asked if they had anything to say for themselves. Urgu admitted quietly that they shouldn't have gone to the Chung family's village, though secretly he wasn't sorry at all. Because of what happened, I'd cut ties with that family completely, meaning I'd never send our things away to them again. I told them both plainly that what they'd done was reckless, not because they'd confronted the Chung family, but because they'd gone unprepared and without any real plan. If Dashin and I hadn't shown up when we did, they could have been left tied up all night without food or water, in real danger. I warned Urga that being 16 and clever wasn't the same as being wise, and told Sanyu that being strong at 14 didn't mean he could take on grown men, brute force without thinking would get him hurt. Both boys looked stunned. They'd expected punishment for causing trouble, not for being unprepared. It almost seemed like I truly had given up on the Chung family for good. I told them their punishment would simply be to fetch 2 buckets of water each. Urga looked confused. Fetching water was already a normal chore, hardly a real punishment, but Sania grabbed the buckets eagerly, and they headed out together. I went to the kitchen and told Wu Huanyang to heat water for baths, since everyone was exhausted and needed to wash properly. Searching the old memories in this body, I realized none of them had bathed in ages. They usually only rinse their hands and faces, and I could barely stand how much everyone smelled by now, myself included, despite the water shortage. As the village quieted down for the night, my sons returned with buckets of water. I pulled out an old wooden tub, mixed hot and cold water, and asked Sidon if he wanted to wash himself or have help. He turned red and insisted on doing it alone, clearly embarrassed. He'd never actually bathed indoors before, always just swimming in the river before the drought hit. Since he was covered head to toe in dirt, I used my shopping panel to buy a small bar of soap, telling him I'd secretly grabbed it from his grandmother's house. None of them had ever seen or heard of soap before. I taught him how to use it, and he happily scrubbed himself covered in bubbles in the yard. His brothers teased him for taking too long, then playfully helped by tickling him until he squealed and begged to be let go, laughing the whole time. Listening to their laughter from the yard, I found myself smiling too. One by one, everyone took turns bathing, and by the end the whole yard smelled like soap, everyone noticeably cleaner. That night, I finally slept well for the first time. The next morning, the village woke up early, as always. I got up quietly while the 3 boys still slept soundly. Wu Huanyang was already outside washing yesterday's dirty laundry. Dashin grabbed his hoe, ready to head to the fields, but I told him to come to town with me instead. I asked Wu Huanyang to stay home and organize things rather than climb the mountain again, worried after her near fall the day before. She asked where else she could gather vegetables, if not the mountain, so I suggested she and Sidon dig for sow thistle in our own fields instead, while the other 2 boys searched the mountains for mushrooms and ferns. An ox cart waited at the village entrance, charging 1 coin per ride into town. Dashin and I climbed aboard along with a few other villagers. Since we'd both bathed the night before, we looked noticeably cleaner than usual, though our clothes were still worn and patched. One of the village women, clearly no friend of mine, sneered and asked where I was headed, mocking my usual trips to my birth family's village, where I'd apparently gotten beaten. I shot back sharply, comparing her nosy question to her husband's own tendency to pry into my business, which wasn't really either of their concern. She bristled immediately, demanding what I meant by that. I told her coolly that she might want to keep a closer eye on her husband instead of worrying about my business. She nearly exploded with anger, suspecting her husband might be involved with me somehow, though my calm demeanor made it clear it wasn't an affair, meaning her husband had likely been the one pursuing me, unwanted. She fumed silently rather than make more of a scene in front of everyone. I closed my eyes to rest. As the saying goes, a widow's doorstep draws plenty of trouble. Since the old me had split from her husband's family and lived alone, several village men had taken it as an opportunity to pester her. She'd always been sharp-tongued enough to chase them off, except for this one persistent man, her husband, who kept coming around anyway. My comment was meant as a warning, so his wife would rein him in before I lost my patience and did something drastic myself. The sun rose, and the ox cart stopped in the busy town of Pingan. Dashin and I hopped off and headed straight for the pawn shop, weaving past food stalls already filling the streets with delicious smells. I paused outside the shop and sent Dashin off to buy some meat buns while I went in alone. Inside, the shopkeeper examined my silver hairpin and offered only 100 coins for it, far less than what my late husband must have originally paid. He explained that the piece was old-fashioned and that many people were pawning jewelry lately, driving prices down. Being called old auntie by the shopkeeper stung a little, but I decided the low offer wasn't worth parting with something so meaningful and took the hairpin back. Outside, Dashan returned with the buns, curious how much I'd gotten. I lied and told him 200 coins. Really, that number came from what was left in my shopping panel after buying spices and soap the day before, plus the buns that morning. He was thrilled, thinking we'd have plenty of food money now, relieved at the thought of having real grain stored at home again. I sent him off with 10 coins to buy salt and other seasonings at the general store, while I headed to the grain shop myself. Prices there shocked me. Rice at 12 coins a pound, millet at 5, wheat flour at 8. All far more expensive than what the old memories told me they used to cost, even recently. I ducked into an empty alley and used my shopping panel instead, where prices were much cheaper. I bought 20 pounds of rice, 20 pounds of flour, and a new iron cooking pot, filling my basket completely. Too heavy to carry anymore. Meeting back up with Dashan, he showed me the tiny bit of salt he'd managed to buy for 10 coins, complaining about rising prices. I told him I'd already gotten some myself. As we prepared to head back, the street suddenly buzzed with alarm. A wealthy family's home had been robbed the night before, 1,000 pounds of rice stolen by bandits. People spoke nervously about locking their doors at night. Sure enough, the grain shop's price board had already jumped to 15 coins a pound for rice. I sighed, knowing that with grain already scarce, a robbery like this would only make things worse for ordinary people. Thankfully, I had my shopping panel to fall back on, but everyone else here would suffer the consequences of rising prices. On the cart ride home, our neighbor Zhao noticed my new pot, remarking on its fine craftsmanship and asking which blacksmith made it. I dodged the question, refusing to explain where it really came from. He assumed privately that I was being wasteful buying a pot when food was scarce. The other villagers on the cart grumbled about the state of things. Grain too expensive to afford, families down to just a few days of food left, praying for rain or government relief. Someone mentioned hearing that another region was suffering from too much rain instead, flooding out their crops, making everyone worry whether the government could handle disasters happening everywhere at once. Suddenly, something landed on my head, and I froze, terrified. Despite everything I'd survived, I still couldn't stand bugs. Dashan carefully removed it, only to go pale himself. It was a locust. The women on the cart gasped, remembering last year's locust plague that had devastated the region. Someone tried to calm everyone down, insisting it was just one bug, and our neighbor Fugue's wife crushed it under her shoe without hesitation. Everyone knew the old saying, where locusts pass, nothing green survives. A locust swarm was even more feared than drought, since a swarm could strip fields bare within a single day. Last year's plague had left our village with nothing, surviving only through government aid and careful planting through the following seasons. No one wanted to face that again. Back home, only Wu Huanyang was there, mending clothes. I had her shut the gate immediately. After hearing about the robbery in town, I knew better than to let anyone see how much food we now had, which was also why I'd hidden everything under the iron pot in my basket keeping. Even Dashan in the dark about exactly what I'd bought. I unpacked everything at once. 20 pounds of rice, 20 pounds of flour, some fresh pork belly I'd secretly bought too, a large bag of salt, and various spices, covering the entire table. I was completely out of coins now, meaning I'd need to head back to the mountains that afternoon to earn more. I handed the pork belly to Wu Huanyang, announcing we'd have braised pork for lunch. She blinked, confused, asking what exactly braised pork even was. In our village, people only ate 2 meals a day, morning and evening, never at noon. So when the smell of pork suddenly drifted through the air that afternoon, it caught everyone's attention. My neighbor, Aunt Wang, sniffed the air and immediately recognized pork, something almost nobody could afford these days. Following the smell, she ran into Sidon carrying a huge basket of sow thistle he'd dug up because I'd told him it was tasty. She scoffed privately, knowing the plant was bitter and hard to cook, clearly thinking I'd tricked him into thinking it was a treat. She pulled out half a cornbread and pushed it into his hands despite his protests, grumbling about how I always sent good food to my birth family while starving my own children, mocking how the old me had gotten what she deserved by being beaten by her own brother. She told Sidon he should move out someday and not end up like his older brother and sister-in-law, working themselves to the bone with nothing to show for it, calling me worse than a wicked stepmother. I came out just as she was scolding him. Despite everything, I understood why she resented the old me so much. We were close neighbors, and the old me had clearly taken advantage of her kindness many times, even while insulting her constantly. Yet somehow, and Wang still secretly fed my children out of pity. There was truth in the old saying that a good neighbor matters more than distant family, and mending things with her could actually help us. But changing my attitude too suddenly would look suspicious, so I decided to keep some of the old sharpness for now. I walked over and took Sidon's basket, telling her flatly that we had real meat to eat today, so we didn't eat her cornbread. A mix of mockery and pride, channeling the old me's personality. She gasped, stunned that I could suddenly afford meat. I told her proudly that since the Chung family had split my head open, I decided to take back what I used to give them and keep it for my own family instead. This wasn't really about bragging. I wanted word to spread through her gossip that I'd truly broken from my birth family for good, and that I was determined to take better care of my own household from now on. She rolled her eyes, insisting I should be saving money for grain instead of wasting it on meat, repeating my mother-in-law's old complaints about me being wasteful. Still, I could tell the smell of pork made her mouth water despite herself, and she made a mental note to trade some grain for meat herself after harvest season. Back home, Sidon ran straight to the kitchen, eyes glued to the pot of braised pork bubbling away. I quietly warned him never to tell anyone outside the family about what we ate, worried word might reach his uncle, who would surely try to take it from us. He promised eagerly to keep it secret. I fed him a small bite, and he begged for more, already hooked. I sent him to fetch his brothers while Wu Huanyang plated the pork and started the rice cooking. I asked Dashan, who'd once been an apprentice mason in town, to build us a second small stove using clay and stones from the riverbank, so we could cook two things at once and save firewood. He got to work right away. Just as the rice finished cooking and the house filled with delicious smells, Sidon came running back in a panic, saying his older brothers were caught in an argument with someone. I sighed, wondering how those two managed to get into trouble so often. Dashan immediately dropped his tools to go help, but I stopped him, telling him to finish the stove instead. I'd handle it myself. Sending the oldest son barging in would only make things worse. A mother stepping in made more sense. Sidon led the way, explaining that the man arguing with his brothers was Zhang the troublemaker, father of Zhang Dagong, the boy who'd tried to steal Sidon's rabbit the day before. It was obvious this was payback for that failed attempt, meaning my sons were caught in a fight that wasn't really their fault. We reached the village well, the only one still producing water, always busy with people in line. A crowd had already gathered to watch Zhang and my two sons arguing. I called out, asking Zhang why a grown man was picking fights with two teenage boys. He spat and insisted he was defending the whole village's interests, complaining that my sons had already hauled over a dozen buckets of water home the night before and were back again today, hogging more than their fair share while other families went without. Our village had 3 wells, but only the one at the entrance still produced water. Nobody knew how much longer it would last. Villagers usually took turns fetching water during the day, though some came at night too, and there was no rule against collecting water twice in a row. It became clear this troublemaker, Zhang, was deliberately targeting my sons. Ergu argued that even the village elder hadn't stopped them from drawing water, so why should Zhang be allowed to? Zhang sneered and kicked over Ergu's bucket, insisting our family used too much water and inconvenienced everyone else. Sania charged at him like an angry bull, but Zhang grabbed him by the collar, ready to hit him. I stepped in immediately, telling him to stop. The crowd parted as I walked through, pulling Sania behind me protectively and accusing him of bullying a widow and her fatherless children. Zhang mocked that no one could really bully me, bringing up how I'd stolen his son's rabbit the other day, threatening to ban my whole family from the well because of it. I fired back that his son had actually attacked my youngest son first, scratching his wrist and tearing his clothes trying to steal the rabbit from him, a debt I hadn't even settled yet, and now he had the nerve to kick over our water bucket too. Since Zhang had a poor reputation in the village for being lazy and troublesome, several bystanders spoke up in my favor, recalling other times his son had stolen from them. People noted how uncharacteristically articulate I sounded compared to my usual outbursts, and someone pointed out that any mother would protect her children the same way. Embarrassed by the crowd's reaction, Zhang threatened to hit me since I was just a woman. I stepped forward and offered my head to him directly, daring him to hit me, pointing out that my own brother had already split my skull open once and had to pay compensation, so Zhang could pay in rice if he dared to do the same. I advanced on him, and he instinctively backed away, realizing that hitting a woman with my reputation could cost him dearly, especially with no spare grain to pay compensation, and worse, with my reputation for dramatic scenes, he risked being blamed publicly for driving a poor widow to some tragic end. A man in the crowd, Zhao Fugue, spoke up defending me, earning an immediate scolding from his own wife, who dragged him away by the ear, suspicious he had feelings for me. Others in the crowd sided with me too, suggesting Zhang settle the matter with the village elder if he disagreed. Zhang spat on the ground and stormed off with his buckets instead. I let out a breath of relief, realizing how vulnerable I actually was. All I really had was quick words, no real way to protect myself physically. I decided I needed to find something for self-defense soon. I thanked the women who'd spoken up for me, standing tall and speaking clearly, looking noticeably different from the usual dramatic troublemaker they knew. Several onlookers seemed surprised at how composed I'd handled things instead of throwing a fit like before. I led my two sons home, both of them anxious, expecting punishment. But when we arrived and smelled the rich aroma of cooking meat, I simply told them to wash up for lunch. Ergo asked, surprised, if I wasn't going to punish them. I told them plainly they hadn't done anything wrong. The whole conflict had been about Zhang's own pettiness over a rabbit and some water, nothing they could control. I filled a bowl generously with braised pork and handed it to Sidon, telling him to deliver it to his grandmother, claiming we'd taken it back from the Chung family. I knew that behind the scenes, my mother-in-law had been secretly feeding these boys for years despite my own neglect. Without her help, they'd likely be even thinner than they already were. Having built a business from nothing in my old life, I understood the value of good relationships, and repairing things with the Zhao family made sense, especially since half the village shared their surname and were all related generations back. Staying on good terms with them would make life here much easier. Sidon ran off eagerly toward his grandparents' house, bowl in hand. It was midday, and the whole family was gathered, the men resting, the women mending clothes, the children sorting through the morning's foraged vegetables. "Grandma," Sidon burst through the gate. "Mother sent this for you." The rich smell of braised pork immediately caught everyone's attention, and all the children in the yard looked up at once, drawn in by the irresistible scent drifting from the bowl. My mother-in-law was truly shocked, setting down her sewing to inspect the colorful bowl of meat Sidon brought. He explained excitedly that I'd gone to visit my brother's family and taken back the silver hairpin my late husband had given me, trading it in town for meat. Then he dashed off, worried about missing out on his own share back home. My mother-in-law wondered aloud whether I'd finally broken things off with the Chung family. My second daughter-in-law thought it sounded promising, hoping I'd finally stop giving away the family's good things to my birth family. But my mother-in-law grumbled about the wastefulness, pointing out that hairpin could have bought plenty of grain instead of meat, worrying I still couldn't plan for the future. My third daughter-in-law wondered aloud if I regretted splitting from the family and might be angling to move back in. After all, everyone was struggling with food shortages now, and if my birth family wouldn't help, maybe I was trying to soften up the Zhaos instead. My mother-in-law scoffed, reminding everyone that legal papers had been signed when I split off. Moving back wouldn't be simple, and if it did happen, I'd have to submit to her authority completely. Reassured by that thought, she decided the meat was fine to eat after all, and called all 6 grandchildren over. Each child excitedly ran up and received one piece of meat, savoring every bite, while a few pieces were saved in the pot for the men to eat later. The children complained good-naturedly about the small portions, and my second daughter-in-law remarked that I seemed different lately. My third daughter-in-law, however, felt bitter privately with only 2 children compared to my second sister-in-law's 4. Her family got the short end of an equal split, something she blamed on her own inability to bear a son. Back home, my own family sat down to a rich lunch: braised pork, fried wild fern, and 6 bowls of white rice. Everyone ate eagerly and silently, wiping the plate completely clean, even using leftover sauce to flavor their rice. The boys leaned back afterward, thoroughly satisfied, marveling at how delicious real braised pork tasted for the first time in their lives. Wu Huanyang understood exactly what had made the dish so good. Rendered pork fat, brown sugar caramelized until fragrant, and precious soy sauce coating the meat, plus the same fat used to stir-fry the vegetables until they tasted better than she'd ever imagined possible. After lunch, while Wu Huanyang cleaned up, I took my 4 sons up the mountain again. Having spent every coin in town that morning, I needed to earn more money soon through foraging to feel secure again. The afternoon sun was brutal, and the rice fields looked worse than ever, leaves curling and dying from lack of water. Up in the forested mountains, though, shade offered some relief, and many village women and children were foraging for that evening's food. Most people stuck to gathering common ferns and purslane on the lower slopes, but I headed deeper into the forest, hoping to find rare mushrooms most villagers were too afraid to touch. My panel alerted me to matsutake mushrooms nearby, a treasure worth hundreds of coins per pound in my old world. Trying to stay calm, I split up the boys to search for different things: ferns, mushrooms, firewood, and wild fruit, while I quietly headed toward an old pine tree covered in thick bushes. Beneath the leaves, I found 5 matsutake mushrooms growing in the soft soil, weighing just under a pound total. Selling them earned me a substantial sum, nearly 400 coins for such a small amount. Continuing on, I found more mushrooms in the surrounding bushes, earning even more. Altogether, I now had over 500 coins, close to half a tael of silver. Just as I was about to keep searching, I heard shouting nearby. Peering through the bushes, I saw 2 women fighting over a bird's nest full of eggs, Aunt Wang from next door, and Fugue's wife, each insisting their own child had found it first, pulling each other's hair while their kids watched, wide-eyed. 6 tiny bird eggs sat in the nest below. I licked my lips to spite myself. I wasn't normally food-obsessed, but ever since arriving in this strange place, food had become a constant thought. I made a mental note to have Sidon search for bird nests later. Uninterested in their squabble, I turned to leave, when suddenly, something fell from above and hit me directly on the head. I reached up and touched my head, feeling something spiky in my hand. When I broke it open, I was surprised to find it was a chestnut. Looking up, I spotted an old chestnut tree hidden among the surrounding trees, its green-husked chestnuts easy to miss from a distance. Since I'd been worrying about what to feed everyone that evening, this felt like a lucky discovery. I shook the trunk, and a shower of chestnuts fell to the ground. The noise caught the attention of Aunt Wang and Fugue's wife nearby, who quickly settled their earlier squabble over the bird eggs and hurried over once they realized what the sound meant. There were actually 3 or 4 chestnut trees clustered together, so all 3 of us grabbed different trees and shook them, working quietly and quickly before anyone else could show up and take a share. Soon my basket was completely full, along with theirs, and more villagers started arriving to join in. I ended up with over 20 pounds of chestnuts, enough to last us for days. I searched further into the woods hoping to find an even bigger grove that could help feed the whole starving village, but sadly, this was the only cluster of trees around. I met back up with my sons. Sidon proudly showed off wild fruit he'd found, while Dashin and Ergu returned with baskets full of vegetables and mushrooms. Sanyu had a tall stack of firewood bundled and ready near where he'd been chopping. We headed home with a great haul, still early enough before dinner that I decided to make candied chestnuts as a treat. The chestnuts weren't fully ripe yet, so they needed to be scored, steamed, and cooked properly. I poured in the pork fat we'd rendered that morning, melted a big chunk of rock sugar into syrup, and stirred the chestnuts through it until they turned a rich caramel color. Wu Huanyang watched nervously, worried about how much oil I was using so freely. That jar could have lasted months, normally. Still, she reminded herself that we'd survived plenty of lean months before without any oil at all, so this wouldn't hurt us. The sweet smell of caramelizing chestnuts drifted through the whole house, and soon Dashan and Sidon came running, unable to resist the aroma. I let Sidon try one, and despite burning his fingers pulling off the shell, he devoured it immediately, amazed at how delicious a simple chestnut could taste with sugar and oil. Just then, my nephew Wang appeared at the gate, sent by his grandmother with a bowl of boiled chestnuts as a gift. I thanked him and sent him off, though he seemed nervous around me, clearly remembering being scolded harshly by the old me in the past. I set aside a portion of the sweet chestnuts to send back with him later as a thank you, then let the boys grab handfuls to snack on before heading out to play, warning them not to overeat since it might upset their stomachs. Sidon, mouth stuffed full, wandered off to the village center, pockets bulging with chestnuts. There he found a group of kids gathered around another boy, Nichio, who had chestnuts of his own, and was showing them off while his friends begged for a taste. Another boy, Taiju, the village elder's grandson, arrived with his own bowl and generously shared bits with everyone. The kids compared whose mother's cooking tasted best, each boy proudly bragging about his own family. When Sidon offered his own share, insisting his mother's cooking was the best of all, the children eagerly tried them too, comparing flavors with wide-eyed delight. One clever boy named Huzi teased Sidon, remembering how I used to be known mainly for hitting people rather than cooking well, wondering how my chestnuts could possibly taste this good. Sidon lifted his chin proudly and declared, without a hint of doubt, that his mother didn't hit anyone anymore, that his mother was now the best mother in the whole world. The sweet smell of chestnuts still lingered in the air. Nichio, the neighbor's boy, followed Sidon around, begging for one more taste. Sidon hesitated, having only 2 chestnuts left, before finally biting into one and handing over the smaller half, then dashing home before Nichio could ask for more. Nichio couldn't bear to eat his half and instead brought it home to his mother, Aunt Wang, asking if she could learn to cook chestnuts the same way. She sniffed the sweetness and took a bite, immediately criticizing me for wasting oil and sugar so recklessly, mocking how I only thought about eating well today without any thought for tomorrow. Hardly surprising, she added, that my own mother-in-law looked down on me. Her complaints carried through the walls to where I was chopping vegetables for dinner. I stayed calm, used to the constant gossip and criticism from neighbors given my reputation. But Sanya grew furious hearing it, grabbing his axe and storming outside to confront her. Aunt Wang was startled, insisting she'd always been kind to the boys, sneaking them food during hard times even while their own mother ignored them. Sanyu argued back that things had changed. I now cooked treats specifically for them, which was why Sidon had extra to share in the first place. I called him back inside to help stack firewood, and he obeyed immediately. Aunt Wang stood there, puzzled by how different the family seemed now. Normally, the boys never defended me, and Wu Huanyang certainly never used to sit calmly sewing while I did actual chores myself. For dinner, Wu Huanyang made wheat noodles while I prepared cold dressed vegetables, a refreshing change from the usual coarse, scratchy buckwheat most families ate. Everyone enjoyed the meal thoroughly, finishing every last drop. Afterward, I brought out the wild fruits Sidon had found earlier, sweet and tart, and the family ate until they were completely full. Sidon happily remarked that he wished every day could be this satisfying. Privately, Urga calculated that the rice and flour I'd bought that morning would only last about a week at our current rate of eating. Sanyo asked directly what we'd do once that ran out. Dashan reassured everyone that the harvest was only about 20 days away, so we wouldn't go hungry forever. But his words brought a heavy silence over the table. Everyone knew the drought had dried up the river completely, and without water, there was no way the rice crop could actually produce grain when harvest time came. The whole village was quietly dreading what would happen once the fields failed to deliver. I waved off their worries, telling them not to think too far ahead and to get some rest. That night, once the boys had fallen asleep beside me as usual, I drifted off too, until a piercing scream shattered the quiet, followed by frantic crying. Dashan appeared at the door, telling me thieves had broken into the village. My first instinct was to check our grain storage, and relief washed over me when I found everything still intact. He explained that Aunt Wang's house next door had been robbed of all its grain, and the village men had already gone out to chase the thief down. I got up and went outside, joining the other women comforting Aunt Wang while the men searched. She sat on the ground sobbing, cursing whoever had stolen from her family. Our two households lived at the edge of the village, near the mountain, making us the easiest targets for anyone sneaking in. The Wang family had settled there generations ago as outsiders, given the least desirable land near the village border. Much like the house I now lived in, once belonging to another outsider family whose line had died out after their daughters married away. Aunt Wang wailed about losing everything, grain painstakingly saved by skipping meals, along with the 2 baskets of chestnuts collected just yesterday. The other women murmured in surprise, realizing the Wang family had actually managed to save 50 or 60 pounds of grain, enough to last a couple of months if rationed carefully. The village elder sighed, promising that since harvest was only weeks away, everyone would contribute a little grain to help the Wang family get through until then. Our village elder, also surnamed Zhao, had led the village for over 20 years and was well respected. He was the first to lend the Wang family a pound of grain. Others tried to help too, but with almost nobody having spare food, the whole village together only managed to scrape together 3 pounds, barely enough to last a few days even if rationed carefully. Aunt Wang broke down completely, fainting into her eldest daughter's arms upon receiving it. My mother-in-law was there too, lending half a pound of millet, though privately she suspected my family had spent all our coins on meat rather than saving grain. She went home afterward and, rather than sleeping, gathered her whole household to hide grain around the house. She'd been careful all year to save a good stockpile of millet, buckwheat, and corn flour, distributing small amounts across different rooms so that even if thieves struck, the losses would be manageable, unlike what had happened to the Wangs. Nobody in the village slept well that night. The Wangs were left with only 3 pounds of grain, nowhere near enough to survive until harvest, assuming there even would be a harvest this year. The next morning, shouting erupted from the Wang household. Their eldest daughter, Wang Demai, was on her knees, begging her father not to sell her. Her younger brother Nichio sobbed too, offering himself instead since boys fetched a higher price. Aunt Wang cried as well, pleading with her husband. Wang Yongcheng explained miserably that without grain, they had no other choice. A wealthy family in town was offering enough money to buy over 100 pounds of food, and he insisted Demai would actually be better off there than starving with them. I overheard the commotion from my own yard and decided to step in. I grabbed half the chestnuts I'd collected the day before and walked over, leaning against the wall with a sharp, mocking tone, pointing out how unfair it was that the village elder had given them grain while I'd received nothing. I claimed, falsely, that a shopkeeper in town had offered 2 taels of silver to buy my own son Sidon as an heir, and declared that even desperate as I was, I would never actually sell my own child, no matter how bad things got. I tossed the chestnuts toward them, offering to trade the food for a day of Demai's labor at my house instead of letting her be sold. Demai, despite knowing my reputation wasn't kind, jumped at the chance to avoid being sold and followed me immediately without hesitation. Aunt Wang, secretly relieved, blocked the gate so her husband couldn't easily chase after her daughter. Wang Yongcheng sat smoking silently, while Aunt Wang picked up the sack I'd left behind, surprised to find 4 or 5 pounds of good chestnuts inside, precious, given how thoroughly the trees nearby had already been picked clean. She declared firmly that if my messy, difficult family could survive without selling children, so could hers, insisting she'd rather eat tree bark or dirt first. Her husband, reluctantly, agreed to wait until after the harvest to decide anything further, though if the harvest failed completely, selling children might become unavoidable for many families, not just theirs. Back home, I sat Demai down and told her honestly that if her father truly intended to sell her, nothing I said would stop him for long. She wiped her tears silently, saying nothing. I understood the deeper reality here. In this era, families favored sons over daughters, and as the eldest daughter in a family with 3 girls and 1 boy, Demai bore the heaviest burden of that imbalance. I told her to eat something before helping with chores, then had Wu Huanyang cook porridge with buckwheat flour and vegetables, choosing not to use our nicer wheat flour since we had a guest present. Everyone in the village ate similarly, though ours was thicker than most. While breakfast cooked, Sidon tugged at my sleeve, asking nervously if it was true someone had really offered 2 taels of silver to buy him. This wasn't entirely made up. After his father's death, a childless family in a neighboring village had once offered money to adopt him as an heir, something the old me had actually considered before my mother-in-law furiously chased them off. I gently pinched his cheek, telling him that once he grew up and got married, he'd better not forget his mother. He nodded fiercely, promising to take care of me forever, making sure I always had rice and meat to eat. I couldn't help but laugh. Soon the smell of breakfast filled the house, and the whole family gathered around the table. Demai was pulled in to sit too, given her own bowl of vegetable porridge. She protested, insisting she hadn't done any work yet to earn it, especially since I'd already given her family a bag of chestnuts. Even back when her own family still had food to spare, she'd never eaten porridge quite this thick and filling. The whole house smelled wonderful. My 4 sons ate eagerly, and even usually shy Wu Huanyang finished her whole bowl of porridge. Demai looked stunned. Her mother always claimed our family barely scraped by, but this seemed like far more food than her own family had. I told her to eat quickly, since I had work for her to do afterward. After some internal struggle, she gave in and finished her bowl too. Sidon even shared 2 candied chestnuts with her, remembering how she used to sneak him bits of cornbread in the past, a small kindness he clearly hadn't forgotten. After breakfast, I asked Demai to stay and help Wu Huanyang forage in the fields, promising she could go home by noon. She was confused. With the bag of grain I'd already given her family, she hadn't expected to actually work for it, and it seemed like I was quietly trying to help her rather than really needing the labor. I set off with my 4 sons toward the mountains, hoping to build on yesterday's earnings. At the base of the mountain, we ran into my sister-in-law, Sunshur, married to my husband's 3rd brother, out foraging with her daughter Manhwa. She greeted me warmly, remarking that I looked paler than before, meant as flattery, though I found the compliment absurd given my rough farmer's hands and tan skin now. I made a mental note to buy skincare products once I had enough money. In my old life, people always said I looked younger than 33, but here, 33 made me practically an old grandmother already, given how short lifespans tended to be in this era. As we walked, Sunshur commented that I looked like I'd gained weight from eating so much meat lately, which annoyed me more than anything else she'd said, since being older, darker, and heavier, all at once felt like too much to bear. I quickly realized her comment was really just a roundabout way of prying into how much silver I had, especially after breaking ties with the Chung family. Recalling the old memories, I understood the family dynamics better. The old me had always looked down on her sisters-in-law, given her status as the eldest daughter-in-law with 4 sons and a husband with military rank. After the split, contact between them had mostly stopped. I deflected her question, claiming any silver had already gone toward my nephew's education, then turned the conversation around, asking how much grain my mother-in-law still had stored. Chunhwa started to answer honestly, but Sunshur cut her off quickly, worried I might use the information to justify moving back into the family home, especially given how much my mother-in-law favored me for having given her 4 grandsons. We continued deeper into the forest, past areas already picked clean by other foragers. I pushed further, hoping to find more matsutake mushrooms. Sunshur tried repeatedly to learn more about my finances, growing suspicious about how I could suddenly afford meat, but I ignored her questions and kept walking further than she expected. Eventually, she decided to stop and forage in a patch of untouched vegetables nearby, worried about running out of daylight before her mother-in-law expected her back. Chunhwa noticed me disappearing into a thicket ahead, curious about what I might be searching for, and quietly followed on her own. I set my sons to gather mushrooms and vegetables nearby, while I pushed further alone, hoping to find more valuable mushrooms even if not matsutake. Pushing through thorny bushes and broad leaves, I suddenly stumbled into an open valley between two mountains, filled with withered lotus stalks. This meant a lotus pond had existed here not long ago, likely fed by birds carrying seeds from farther south, since lotus plants typically grew in warmer regions, not usually found this far north. The villagers here, having lived in these mountains for generations, wouldn't have recognized lotus flowers even if they'd seen them blooming, let alone known that the muddy roots beneath held valuable lotus root. In many eras back home, lotus root was considered a delicacy fit for royal tribute. My mind immediately raced through delicious dishes I could make: stir-fried lotus slices, lotus root balls, sweet and sour lotus cakes. Swallowing hard with anticipation, I grabbed a sturdy stick for support and jumped down into the dried-up pond bed. The ground was hard and difficult to dig, and my hands were blistering by the time I finally pulled up one long root, about the length of my arm. Breaking it apart revealed the classic hollow chambers inside, clean and fragrant, though sadly, without enough rainfall, the root hadn't grown thick or starchy enough to be considered valuable, and my shopping panel didn't even offer to buy it. Still, I tossed it into my basket and stood there, staring thoughtfully at the 3 or 4 acres of lotus field stretching out before me. Beyond the thicket, Manhwa stared in disbelief at what she'd found, then bolted down the mountain to tell her mother. Sunshine, still half a basket short of vegetables, looked up in alarm as her daughter came racing over, breathless, insisting she'd found something amazing. Meanwhile, I'd already left after digging up just 2 lotus roots. My hands couldn't take much more digging without blistering badly. Manhwa led her mother back to the spot, jumping into the dried pond bed and digging further along where I'd left off, eventually pulling out a long, thin root. Sunshine broke it open, sniffed it cautiously, and took a small bite, pleasantly surprised by its sweet, starchy flavor, similar to sweet potato, though she spat it out rather than risk eating something unfamiliar. She covered the dug-up area with leaves to hide their discovery from anyone else, then rushed back to the village with her daughter to ask her father-in-law about it. Back home, the family's elder patriarch, sitting under the old locust tree smoking his pipe, examined the root carefully. Having traveled and worked in the South years earlier, he recognized it immediately as a delicacy typically sent straight to the capital for the wealthy, something even the locals could rarely afford to taste themselves. This root wasn't just a treat. During famines in the South, families relied on it as an actual food source, much like sweet potatoes. Excited, the old man ordered the whole family gathered immediately, determined to head up the mountain right away, understanding this discovery could genuinely save lives. His wife quickly served everyone a small portion of vegetable porridge before they left, then stayed behind to guard the house and its hidden grain while the rest of the family, 11 people in total, headed up to investigate. They followed Manhwa's directions deep into the mountains, eventually emerging into the same valley I'd found, filled with the withered remains of lotus plants. The old man recognized the dried leaves immediately as lotus, explaining that lotus seeds themselves were even more prized than the roots, typically reserved for nobility in the capital. He proceeded to walk the perimeter of the pond, estimating its size at roughly 4.5 acres, calculating that even with poor rainfall reducing the yield, the field could still produce a couple thousand pounds of edible roots total, though harvesting all of it would take his family many months working together. Standing at the edge, he decided they should inform the village elder rather than keep the discovery secret, reasoning that with so much land, his own family alone couldn't possibly harvest it all, and that other families might stumble upon it too, especially considering the land sat close to the boundary with another village, Hohat, who could easily claim it themselves if word got out too late. His third son argued they should keep it entirely to their own family instead, since they'd found it first. His wife, Sunshine, stayed quiet outwardly but was clearly hoping to share the secret privately with her own birth family in Hohat village, since sharing with the whole community would ruin her chance to help her own relatives get ahead first. The old man ultimately decided to let his family start harvesting immediately, planning to bring the village elder to see it the following morning. Meanwhile, my sons and I headed back down the mountain around midday. I gave the lotus roots I'd found to Wu Huanyang, asking her to wash and slice off a small piece, then carried it myself toward the village elder's house. Walking through the parched fields, I passed farmers sitting helplessly by their dying crops, sighing at the drought that no one could control. All I could do was push forward, trying not to dwell on what I couldn't fix. At the elder's house, his wife was mending clothes in the yard. Seeing me approach made her visibly tense, remembering the chaos I'd caused the year before when I demanded the elders help splitting from my husband's family. She explained that her husband was away in town, called to a meeting with the county magistrate about the ongoing drought. He'd barely slept in weeks worrying over the crisis. The message was clear. Whatever small complaint I'd come with, now wasn't the time to bother him with it. I decided not to mention my actual reason for coming and left, planning to return later instead. As evening fell, the smell of frying filled our yard. I'd made lotus root balls, mixing chopped root with flour and frying them golden brown, filling 2 large bowls. Sidon drooled at the table, and I fed him one, teasing him for still drooling after eating so well lately. He insisted my cooking was simply too delicious to resist. I filled a bowl with 15 balls and sent him running to deliver them to his grandmother. She'd been waiting anxiously at home alone, worried something bad had happened to the rest of the family still out in the deep mountains, fearing wild animals. The delicious smell announced Sidon's arrival before he even reached the gate. She scolded me privately for wasting so much oil again on something new, but couldn't help tasting one, secretly impressed. Still suspicious about my sudden generosity despite the food shortage, she pulled Sidon aside and asked if I'd said anything revealing lately. He innocently repeated that I talked about wanting everyone to eat well, get a new house, and have meat every day. This convinced her I must be plotting to move the family back in with her, and she decided firmly she wouldn't allow it unless I changed my old troublesome ways completely. Back home, Wu Huanyang mentioned how helpful Demai had been all day, digging vegetables, chopping wood, and fetching water. I couldn't help but think about how desperate this era could get, how disasters like this sometimes led to unthinkable tragedies, families selling or even trading children in the worst famines. I hoped fiercely that nothing like that would happen around me. After a quick dinner, I took a bowl of the lotus balls and headed to the village elder's house again, even though night had fallen, a dangerous time with wild animals about. Thankfully, our neighbor's elder patriarch and his family had already made it home safely from their own mountain trip, exhausted but relieved, treating themselves to an extra bit of food. Before finally resting, the old man decided he couldn't wait until morning to report the lotus find to the village elder, despite his wife's protests about the late hour and danger. He headed out immediately. As he approached the elder's house, he overheard my voice already explaining everything inside, how I'd stumbled upon a dried-out pond earlier that day, digging up something strange and white. That turned out to be edible, tasting similar to sweet potato once fried or boiled. I mentioned the size of the area, guessing there could be over 1,000 pounds of it hidden in the mud. The elder's wife lit up at the idea, divided evenly. That could mean nearly 100 pounds per family, enough to stave off hunger for weeks even if it wasn't quite as filling as regular grain. The elder himself tried one of my fried lotus balls and was amazed by the flavor, wondering how something like this had never been discovered in our area before. That's when the old patriarch walked in, recognizing the root immediately as something he'd encountered decades earlier during his travels south, a delicacy typically reserved as tribute for the capital. He confirmed what I'd found was genuinely valuable, capable of substituting for grain in a pinch, even if it wasn't quite as filling. Excited, the elder insisted on heading up to inspect the site himself that very night, despite his wife's worries about wolves in the dark. He quickly changed into proper shoes while she prepared torches to light their way and keep predators at bay. The old patriarch turned to me, admitting he'd misjudged me before, assuming I'd be selfish or greedy given the discovery's value, yet here I was, immediately reporting it to benefit the whole village rather than hoarding it secretly for my own family. I brushed off his praise, explaining simply that my family of 6 couldn't possibly harvest all of it alone anyway. Privately, I knew the deeper truth. With my shopping panel, my family would never truly starve no matter what happened, since I could always trade small amounts of foraged goods for real food. I didn't think of myself as especially selfless, but I also couldn't bring myself to fight desperate, hopeless people over food that could save their lives instead. The elder headed out with torches, joined by his 3 sons, while the old patriarch gathered his other 2 sons as well, 7 grown men together, making the nighttime trip up the mountain far safer than going alone. The night was quiet except for the sound of insects and birds. I'd struggled to sleep at first after arriving in this world, but by now I'd adjusted, waking naturally at first light. Early that morning, the village elder called everyone together under the old locust tree. Everyone except elderly folks, small children, and pregnant women. Word had already started spreading about the lotus root discovery hidden in the mountains. The elder announced that with no farm work possible during the drought, everyone able-bodied should join the effort to dig up as much as possible. When someone asked how it would be divided, he explained fairly that whatever each family dug up, they'd keep, but every family would also contribute 10 pounds to a shared pool for elderly and vulnerable villagers who couldn't join the digging, adding up to roughly 200 pounds set aside for the community. Everyone grew excited at the prospect. 100 pounds of food per family could mean the difference between starving and surviving for a whole month if rationed carefully. As the village walked together toward the mountain, gossip spread through the crowd. Apparently, my sister-in-law Sunshur had secretly sent word to her own birth family in a neighboring village overnight, hoping to let them dig alongside us before the rest of the village even knew about the discovery. When the elder and the old patriarch arrived at the site the previous night, they'd found Sunshur's relatives already digging, having claimed part of what should have belonged to our village. The elder, though frustrated, had allowed them to keep a small amount out of compassion for their hungry children, but this incident was exactly why the whole village was mobilized so urgently now, to prevent outsiders from claiming more of what belonged to us. People grumbled angrily about the neighboring village's audacity, given their history of setting traps in shared hunting grounds. Sunshur grew furious hearing herself criticized, insisting privately that her own family deserved some benefit since her daughter had been the one to discover the site in the first place. Unable to argue back without damaging relations further, she turned her frustration on her younger daughter, Manhwa, only 8 years old, pinching her hard enough to bring tears, blaming the girl publicly for spreading gossip to her uncle's village, even though it had been Sunshur's own idea all along. The little girl, already resented by her mother for being born a girl instead of the hoped-for son, silently endured the unfair blame, too afraid to even cry out loud. Watching this, I understood the impulse to favor one's own family, even if it caused conflict with others. Desperate times bred desperate choices in everyone. But I would never let an innocent child take the blame the way Donghua had. Ultimately, poverty and famine brought out selfishness in almost everyone, myself included in some ways. After a short walk, we reached the valley. The dried pond, though modest in size, held layers of lotus root buried in the soil, but the ground was hard and dry, making each root difficult and time-consuming to dig out cleanly. I settled my sons into a shady spot, warning them not to overdo it and to be careful of blistering their hands. Sania boasted about his toughness and dove in eagerly, while Dashan and Ergo worked quickly too. Sidon knelt nearby, cleaning mud off the roots as they came up. Feeling obligated to help despite being technically the head of the household, I knelt down and started digging alongside them. Within minutes, sharp pain shot through my palms, and I discovered 3 painful blisters had already formed. Dashan gently suggested I rest instead, insisting the boys could handle the digging themselves. When I checked their hands, I found they were all completely fine, thick-skinned from years of hard labor, unlike my own soft hands from this body's history of avoiding physical work. I felt oddly embarrassed, though the villagers around me didn't think anything of it. In their eyes, having 4 grown sons meant a mother deserved to rest while they worked. Many nearby women eyed me enviously, especially Sunshur, who had no sons of her own, and grew visibly bitter watching her 2 daughters struggle nearby, their small hands blistering and bleeding without complaint, too scared of her temper to say anything. I rested in the shade for a while before standing up, ready to get back to helping, when suddenly my mental panel chimed with an alert. Ding! A wild, 100-year-old ginseng root has been detected. Deep in the forest, untold riches lay hidden. Instead of joining the others at the pond, I wandered further into the thick trees, following a signal from my shopping panel until I reached an ancient tree with layers of broad leaves. Beneath them grew a wild ginseng plant. I dug carefully with my small shovel and pulled out a pale, radish-shaped root with countless tiny tendrils, 100-year-old wild ginseng. My panel immediately flashed an offer. 120,000 coins, equivalent to 120 taels of pure silver. My heart raced. In this era, families with even 100 taels to their name were rare. I'd just accidentally become genuinely wealthy. I converted the money into a 100-tael note, 15 taels of loose silver, and the rest into copper coins, my coin purse now bulging noticeably. Taking a moment to calm myself, I bought a rabbit from my panel and carried it back to where everyone was digging, announcing cheerfully that I'd gotten lucky catching one nearby before heading home with it. The other diggers looked envious, marveling at my apparent good fortune. My nephew Erwang sidled up to Sidon, hoping for a taste of rabbit meat later. Sania shot back that Erwang had never shared his own family's meat with them before, and Sidon agreed, teasing him for being stingy. Erwang protested he'd changed, offering Sidon a chestnut in exchange for a promise of rabbit meat later, but Sidon dismissed it, insisting nothing tasted as good as my cooking. Erwang nearly cried in frustration, accusing Sidon of being unfair and declaring he'd never play with him again. His father cuffed him on the head for whining instead of just catching his own rabbit, which quickly cheered him up until his grandfather told him to finish digging first. By midday, several village women brought food up the mountain for everyone: cornbread, porridge, various simple dishes. I made sure not to stand out too much, sending buckwheat buns with Wu Huanyang instead of anything fancier, one for each of my sons. After eating, while everyone rested, my nephew De Wang suddenly yelled out that he'd sunk into soft mud. His father scolded him for being careless, and De Wang defensively pointed out that Ergu, my second son, wasn't even married yet either, implying he shouldn't be lecturing him about growing up. I noticed Ergu's face turn bright red at the comment, unusual for someone normally so composed, making me suspect he might have feelings for someone already. Given how young people married and started families in this era, it wasn't surprising, though it still felt strange to me, remembering my own unrequited crush back in school that I never acted on, even into my 30s. Ergu quickly changed the subject, offering to investigate the soft mud himself and hurrying off before I could ask more questions. Curious, I later asked Dashan if he knew anything about it, but he had no idea. Sidon, however, cheerfully revealed that Ergu had once asked him if he wanted a particular girl as a future sister-in-law, even offering to introduce them. I quietly noted my son's early romantic ambitions with some amusement, admiring that he seemed the type to pursue what he wanted directly. After the break, Ergu quietly led me to the softer patch of ground he'd found, explaining that the lotus roots there grew noticeably larger and thicker than elsewhere. Kneeling down, I could feel the moisture in the soil myself, unusual given how thoroughly the drought had dried everything else out, almost like a hidden oasis surrounded by unusually persistent weeds, growing where crops elsewhere had failed. Drawing on some basic geography knowledge from my old life, I guess there might be an underground water source nearby. If true, it could ease the drought significantly, even without rain, though the area covered was too large to pinpoint an exact source without more investigation. I made a mental note to think carefully about how to locate it precisely later. As the afternoon wore on, more villagers discovered similarly soft patches of mud, making the digging easier and the roots larger than expected. Total yield ended up closer to 3,000 pounds rather than the original estimate of 2,000, giving every family a meaningful stockpile. By the time the whole valley was cleared, it was well past midnight. Despite their exhaustion, everyone helped carry the harvest home together, finally collapsing into sleep as dawn broke. My own sons alone had managed to dig up about 100 pounds, safely stored now in our cellar, buried in mud to keep for over a month. The next morning, Wu Huanyang prepared a hearty breakfast, rabbit stew with lotus root, plus wheat and vegetable flatbreads. My sons, still half asleep, rushed eagerly to the table at the smell of food. Before Sanayu could dig in, I stopped him, telling him to fill a bowl first for his grandparents. Sidon remarked how kind I'd become toward his grandparents. I explained gently that since their father had died serving his country, it was only right that I honor his parents in his place, as he no longer could himself. Sidon nodded firmly, declaring he'd do the same for me one day. The summer morning sun was already fierce. After the exhausting all-night dig, most of the village slept in, leaving the streets unusually quiet, while the parched earth still cracked open, desperate for rain. My mother-in-law was cooking vegetable porridge and baking buckwheat flatbreads stuffed with dried radish and beans. Sidon arrived at her door with a steaming bowl of rabbit soup I'd sent over, then quickly tried to run off before she could ask questions. She immediately recognized it as rabbit. The villagers had gossiped about my lucky catch the day before, while everyone else worked themselves to exhaustion digging. Rather than keep the rich soup to herself, she generously poured it into the family's shared porridge pot to share with everyone, but before Sidon could leave, she asked my sister-in-law Sunshur to send back 10 pounds of lotus root in return. Sunshur, still stinging from earlier tension, grumbled under her breath that if I'd wanted lotus root, I should have dug it myself instead of sending my son to beg for some, a comment that visibly annoyed my mother-in-law, especially given Sunshur's own family had secretly tried to claim extra lotus root the night before. The rest of the family arrived, delighted by the smell of real meat in their morning porridge, praising how generous their big sister-in-law had been. My mother-in-law pointedly asked her grandson Dewang if 10 pounds of lotus root seemed like too much to give in exchange for the soup, and he eagerly said he'd trade 20 pounds for even a single bite of meat, clearly embarrassing. Sunshur further, who wished she could disappear. Back at our own table, my family enjoyed a delicious breakfast of rabbit soup with lotus root, the meat falling apart tender after hours of slow cooking, paired with vegetable flatbreads dipped in the rich broth. Afterward, everyone leaned back contentedly, wishing they could just relax there all day. Aunt Wang came by shortly after, awkwardly returning 2 lotus roots as repayment for the chestnuts I'd given her family earlier. I tried to insist it wasn't necessary, since Demai's help around our house more than covered that debt, but she brushed me off gruffly, dropping the roots and leaving before I could argue further. Despite her prickly exterior, I recognized she was someone genuinely worth staying close to. I told my sons to rest instead of going back out to work, since the rice fields were too far gone to bother weeding anyway. Reluctantly, they agreed and went to nap, their growing bodies needing the recovery time after such an exhausting day and a restless night before. Wu Huanyang sat mending clothes under the shade tree, the family's patched-up garments layered with so many repairs their original fabric was barely visible anymore. Meanwhile, I sat thinking about the underground water source I suspected existed near the lotus pond. Trying to recall bits of geography knowledge from my old life, I realized locating it precisely would normally require modern surveying equipment, obviously unavailable here, and far too expensive even through my shopping panel. Searching further, I eventually found an old historical text about locating underground water sources, cheap enough to buy, and spent over an hour reading through it carefully in private. It offered a simple method worth testing, though I couldn't be sure it would actually work until I tried it myself. Afterward, I hid the book away and returned to the front yard, where Dashan was chopping wood, occasionally glancing over at Wu Huanyang with obvious affection, the two exchanging shy, lingering looks before quickly looking away again, clearly smitten with each other. I couldn't help but feel a little envious watching young love bloom so openly, still single myself even after 33 years. Wu Huanyang blushed deeply, embarrassed to be caught. I cleared my throat and changed the subject, asking Dashan to help identify a plant I sketched in the dirt, describing its leaf shape. He recognized it immediately as mugwort, mentioning it grew commonly just behind our house. Dashan led me behind our house, where a field of wild mugwort grew, mostly dried out from the relentless sun. I bent down and smelled it, confirming it was the plant I needed. I told him to cut it all down and pile it in the yard. He was puzzled. Mugwort didn't burn well as firewood, being smoky and inefficient, but I explained I wanted exactly that smoky quality for a purpose I hadn't shared yet. He cut what he could and stacked it up. I packed a full basket tightly with it. When Urga asked what it was for, I simply told him to come with me up the mountain after lunch, and he'd see. We had a satisfying lunch of white rice, stir-fried lotus root, and wild mushrooms. Then 5 of us headed up into the mountains. Unlike the day before, almost no one else from our village was out foraging, everyone still recovering from the previous night's exhausting dig. As we approached the dried lotus pond, Sidon suddenly heard voices ahead. Someone else was there. I realized immediately it couldn't be our own villagers, since they were all resting, meaning it had to be people from the rival village, Hohat. Signaling the boys to stay back, I crept forward through the bushes to investigate. I found dozens of grown men standing in the already dug pond, furious that our village had claimed most of the harvest. They argued the mountain sat between both villages and should have been shared equally, blaming our village elder for being too clever to let them in on it fairly. One suggested a darker plan. Since thefts had been common lately, they could disguise themselves as thieves and secretly steal grain from our village at night. My blood ran cold hearing this. I quietly retreated, telling the boys we needed to head back immediately. This wasn't a good time to search for the water source with troublemakers nearby. Halfway down the mountain, Sidon spotted a bird's nest, and Saniu eagerly climbed up to grab 7 eggs. Since I already had access to plenty of eggs through my shopping panel but needed a believable excuse to bring more home, I came up with an idea. I could plant a couple of hens in the woods and let the boys discover them, giving us a natural source of eggs going forward. I bought 2 hens through my panel and set them loose in the bushes nearby. The clucking immediately caught the boys' attention, and they excitedly chased them down together, thrilled at their lucky find. Dashan wondered aloud how wild hens could look so similar to farm-raised ones. But the excitement overrode his suspicion. I explained that since they were hens, they'd lay eggs daily if we kept them, meaning the family could enjoy fresh eggs regularly from now on. Right on cue, since I'd secretly triggered it, both hens settled down and appeared to lay eggs on the spot, astonishing the boys completely, who reacted like it was some kind of miracle. We carried the hens home in high spirits. I sent the boys ahead with a basket while I headed to see the village elder myself, who was standing anxiously by the dried fields, surrounded by villagers peppering him with worried questions about government aid and rising grain prices in town. He looked overwhelmed, unsure how honest to be without causing panic. I approached and told him plainly what I'd overheard. A group of 30-some men from Hohat village scouting our mountain, led by a heavy-set man discussing plans to secretly steal grain from us, disguised as ordinary thieves. I held nothing back, since this concerned the safety of the whole village, not just myself. The surrounding villagers erupted in anger immediately, recalling an old rivalry between the 2 villages from decades earlier, furious that Hohat would try something so underhanded again. Several immediately called for retaliation before the thieves could strike first. The village elder raised his hand, calming the angry crowd. He explained that although the 2 villages had lived peacefully as neighbors for over 20 years since their last dispute, attacking first would put our village in the wrong if the county magistrate ever got involved, but he also promised our grain wouldn't simply be handed over without a fight. Some villagers grew frustrated, unsure how to defend our harvest without provoking a fight. Others, especially those with family ties across the 2 villages through marriage, hesitated to escalate things. One man questioned whether we should really act on my word alone, while another accused me of possibly misheard the conversation, or worse, insinuated something inappropriate between me and the village elder if he took my suggestion seriously. I'd proposed organizing a rotating night watch, 1 person from every household, to catch any intruders before they could steal from us. That troublemaker Zhang, notorious for laziness, spat insults at both me and the elder, hinting at some improper relationship between us. The elder, in his 50s, bristled with fury at the accusation. I fired back sharply, pointing out that if agreeing with my suggestion counted as involvement, then everyone who supported the idea would apparently be involved with me too. Then the old patriarch stepped forward. firmly defending my proposal, reminding everyone that generations ago the whole village had shared the Zhao surname and worked together harmoniously, though disputes had grown more common as outsider families settled in over the years. He suggested framing the watch as a Zhao family initiative to protect their own stores specifically, leaving other families to decide for themselves. An elderly widow named Granny Zhu spoke up next, refusing to be excluded despite her family's different surname, insisting her grandson Huzi, quick-witted despite his young age, join the watch. Her family had suffered greatly over the years, losing both her husband and several children to illness after fleeing to this village as refugees, leaving her to raise her last grandson alone. Having received a decent share of lotus root the day before, she had every reason to defend it fiercely. Aunt Wang, still stinging from her own recent robbery, spoke up next in support, offering her husband to join the watch. Others quickly followed suit, each family volunteering someone, frustrating Zhang further as he watched the community rally without him. Unable to argue his way out, he stormed off in a huff. The elder called for quiet and had Taizhu, the most literate boy in the village, having picked up some reading and writing while working at a restaurant in town, start recording names on a scrap of paper. Watching his clumsy, uneven handwriting as villagers signed up, I couldn't help but find it amusing, especially since everyone kept praising his writing as impressively skilled, unaware of how basic it actually was. Someone mentioned my birth family's village, bragging about my nephew's scholarly achievements, and I noticed a few curious glances my way, though nobody dared ask directly given my public break with the Chung family. Since Taizhu couldn't write every character correctly, he simply drew circles for unfamiliar words, leaving the paper covered in scribbled marks by the time everyone had signed up. As I turned to leave, I noticed a boy standing quietly nearby, watching everything unfold. It was Zhang Dagong, the troublemaker's son who'd tried stealing Saiden's rabbit earlier. His expression was unreadable in the shadows. After a moment, he turned and walked away without a word. Back home, I went straight to my room and opened my shopping panel, deciding it was time to buy something for self-defense, given the uncertainty of when Ho-Hot villages men might strike. I settled on a small foldable knife, compact enough to hide up a sleeve, testing its sharpness by slicing clean through the corner of a wooden table. Sanny walked in just as I finished testing it, forgetting whatever he'd come to say the moment he spotted the blade, eyes lighting up with excitement. I calmly claimed I'd found it discarded in an alley during our trip to town, and he couldn't take his eyes off it, clearly wanting it badly. I ended up giving it to him outright, delighting him completely. Finally, I bought myself a small electric shock ring, capable of delivering a single powerful jolt strong enough to stun an adult, an expensive purchase, but worth it for my own protection. I strung it on a cord and wore it around my neck, hidden beneath my clothes. Dinner that night was unusually rich. Egg pancakes made from 2 eggs and flour, 7 boiled bird eggs on a plate, stir-fried greens, fried lotus balls, and a big bowl of white rice for everyone. Despite having eaten well for days now, the boys still couldn't help drooling. I gave each person 1 egg, saving the extra one for Wu Huanyang. She protested modestly, but I insisted, glancing at her belly and promising to have a doctor come check on her once things settled down. Since I'd never been pregnant myself, I figured regular checkups couldn't hurt, drawing from what I remembered about prenatal care back home. Wu Huanyang's eyes welled up with emotion. She'd endured a hard year in this family, only surviving thanks to Dashan quietly sharing his own food with her in secret. Now, for the first time, she felt like I genuinely cared about her well-being too, moved almost to tears at getting 2 eggs instead of 1 when food had always been so scarce before. I patted her hand gently, telling her not to cry, joking that crying too much now would just mean a fussy baby later. She managed to hold back her tears. Just as we were about to eat, a timid voice called out from the yard. A girl's voice, asking for Urgu. He dropped his chopsticks immediately and rushed outside. Curious, I peered over and saw a thin young woman standing by our wall, clearly dressed in patched clothes but carrying herself gracefully despite the hardship evident in her frame. I couldn't resist teasing Saiden, asking if this was his future sister-in-law. He nodded enthusiastically, confirming her name was Shueqin. Sanyu admired her looks openly, and I had to admit she was quite pretty, especially in the warm evening light. Watching Ergo fumble nervously, unable to meet her eyes, I found the young romance sweet, until I realized the practical implications. If these two were serious about each other, a wedding might be coming soon, which meant real expenses. I had plenty of money thanks to selling that ginseng root, but I still needed a believable way to explain having that much wealth. I asked Dashin casually how much his own wedding had cost, and both he and Wu Huanyang turned bright red, too embarrassed to answer directly. Sidon cheerfully explained that according to their grandmother, the wedding had cost nothing at all, reminding me of the old memories now surfacing. Dashin had fallen for Wu Huanyang while trading salt in town, and her family, seeing the Zhao family's decent standing with a father serving in the military, had agreed to the match without demanding a dowry, even letting her bring home the token betrothal money as her own dowry, money that the old me had promptly taken and given away to my birth family instead. Shortly after the wedding, Dashin's father died, and things fell apart from there, with Wu Huanyang enduring a miserable year in this household ever since, too afraid to complain to her own family for fear they might retaliate against Dashin. Ergu came back inside, awkwardly explaining that Shueqin had heard about our village's lotus root harvest and had come to ask for a loan of grain, originally 20 pounds, though he'd only agreed to lend 10. Since 10 pounds wasn't excessive, and it was clear Ergu genuinely cared about this girl, I told him to go ahead and get it from our seller. Then, turning to Wu Huanyang, I mentioned she hadn't visited her own family since marrying a year ago and suggested she bring 10 pounds of lotus root to check on them the next day, since they were technically our in-laws now too. Wu Huanyang's eyes went wide with disbelief. All year, she'd been unfairly blamed for supposedly favoring her own family with our resources, despite never actually taking anything from us for them. Now, hearing me suggest it openly, she could hardly believe her ears. Outside, though, Shueqin looked disappointed. She'd asked for 20 pounds, not 10, and worried how she'd explain the shortfall to her father. Ergu apologized, explaining honestly that our family genuinely couldn't spare more, since the lotus root had been split evenly among the 4 brothers, and giving away too much would make him no different from how I used to behave with my own birth family. Shueqin, tearing up slightly, accepted this graciously, saying she understood how hard things were for everyone right now, then said her goodbyes. Ergu insisted on walking her partway home, keeping a respectful distance the whole way, careful not to damage her reputation before anything was formally settled between them.
Sitting
alone afterward, I found myself worrying practically about logistics. Our house only had 2 rooms, and if Ergu eventually married, where would the new couple even sleep? Building even a modest house would cost real money, and while I certainly had enough silver saved up, explaining its origin remained a persistent problem I'd need to solve carefully.
I
decided, once I'd properly vetted this girl's character, we could offer a modest betrothal gift to formalize the engagement, planning for an actual wedding sometime after the new year, once spring arrived. Under the clear moonlight, I had an odd dream about the man I'd secretly loved in my old life, kneeling before me with a proposal. My heart raced with excitement, but before I could even accept the ring, one of the boys accidentally kicked me awake. I woke feeling strangely wistful, realizing that in this life, romance was completely off the table for someone in my position. I'd never even held a man's hand back home, and now here I was arranging marriages for my own sons instead. Dragging myself up as dawn broke, I found Dashin had already fetched water for the morning. Ever since I'd insisted everyone wash their face and rinse their mouth before breakfast, this had become a new habit. Wu Huanyang boiled water and did laundry in the yard. I unlocked our grain storage, careful to keep the visible stock steady even while quietly replenishing it. I made porridge with millet, then prepared fried lotus root sandwiches stuffed with egg, since we had no meat on hand that morning. The boys, still half asleep, followed the smell straight to the kitchen, drooling before they'd even properly woken up. I made them wash their faces first. Ergu splashed cold water on himself, clearing his drowsiness, until he spotted someone standing at our gate and rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Sidon called out excitedly, recognizing Shueqin again. Back so soon after visiting the day before. I sighed internally, not particularly eager to witness more young love this early in the morning. Shueqin greeted me nervously, explaining she'd come to speak with Ergu. I waved them off casually, though I kept half an ear on their conversation, purely out of a mother's natural concern, of course. Shueqin mentioned she'd noticed several people patrolling near the village entrance and had been questioned on her way in. Hearing this immediately sharpened my attention. Shueqin's surname, Sun, was shared by several women who'd married into our village from Hohhot. I wondered uneasily if she might actually be gathering information for them. I invited her in for breakfast to buy myself time to observe her more closely. She declined nervously, clearly working up to say something else. Watching her carefully, drawing on years of reading people during my old business career, I noticed her tearful, delicate expression seemed almost performed rather than genuine, quite different from Ergu, who looked completely smitten and unguarded. I smiled warmly and encouraged her to speak freely. She asked, eyes welling with tears, if we could lend her family another 20 pounds of grain. Ergu tensed immediately, glancing at me anxiously, clearly worried about upsetting me before things were even official between them. I explained gently that having already lent grain the day before, giving that much again might upset the balance with my other sons. Sanyu quickly volunteered that he had no objections, and Sidon nearly agreed too until I silenced him with a look. These boys were terrible at helping me negotiate. I turned to Ergu directly, asking if he thought we should really lend more given our own supplies. He hesitated, clearly torn watching Shueqin's tearful expression, practically unable to refuse her anything. Reluctantly, not wanting to seem like I was standing between young love, I offered a compromise, 10 more pounds instead of 20. Shueqin thanked me tearfully, seemingly overjoyed, and Ergu went to fetch it. I gently told Shueqin that Ergu meant well even if he seemed clumsy sometimes, hoping she wouldn't hold it against him. She replied quietly that of course she wouldn't, a response that immediately soured my impression further. My comment had been a small test, downplaying my own son slightly to see her reaction, and her easy agreement suggested she genuinely had been annoyed with him for hesitating, confirming my suspicion that she wasn't quite as innocent as she appeared, young as she was at hiding it. Watching Ergu hand over another 10 pounds only to receive such a hollow show of gratitude in return, I couldn't help feeling he deserved better. But he seemed utterly unaware, cheerfully offering to walk her home. I stopped him, reminding him that with patrols watching the village borders now, being seen alone together could damage her reputation, and sent Wu Huanyang along instead to escort her properly. Once Shueqin's figure disappeared down the path, Ergu turned to thank me sincerely. I asked directly if he truly wanted to marry this girl, and he blushed deeply, nodding quietly. I sighed inwardly. He was clearly too deep in his feelings to notice anything questionable about her. It would be up to me, as his mother, to look into her family's situation properly before things went any further. As dawn broke, I stepped outside and saw the village patrol passing by. The system worked smoothly, 200 villagers divided into 50 rotating teams, each person on duty only 3 times a month, less demanding than expected. Near the old locust tree, a group of women surrounded me, praising my idea. Apparently the night before, a handful of men from Hohhot village had tried sneaking in, but our watch had caught them almost immediately when someone shouted too early before any evidence was actually stolen, so they had to be released. Someone suggested next time we should wait until they'd actually taken something before catching them, ensuring real consequences. Word had also spread that Hohhot's own village elder was now cracking down on his people, embarrassed by the failed attempt. I brushed off the praise, insisting it had really been the whole village's teamwork that mattered. As I smiled, several women stared at me, remarking quietly on how different I seemed lately, softer, more graceful than the sharp-tongued woman they remembered. Feeling a little self-conscious under their attention, I excused myself, heading toward my in-laws' house instead. Behind me, the women speculated about my visit, wondering if I'd finally patched things up with my mother-in-law after our year-long rift. At the gate, I called out for her. She emerged, clearly surprised. Despite our recent food exchanges, I hadn't actually visited her home directly since moving out. She braced herself internally, assuming I'd finally come to ask about moving the family back in, determined not to give in no matter what excuse or tears I might offer. Once I sat down inside with her and Sunshur, I explained I'd actually come to ask about someone else entirely, a girl named Shueqin from Hohot village, wondering if either of them knew anything about her family. My mother-in-law, rarely leaving the village herself, had no information, but Sunshur recognized the name immediately, explaining Shueqin's father was a distant cousin of her own, and that the girl had grown into quite a lovely young woman since Sunshur's own wedding years earlier. I explained casually that I was looking into a potential match for Urgu, hoping to arrange a proper proposal if her character checked out. My mother-in-law lit up internally, having secretly worried about Urgu's future herself. Now delighted I seemed to be taking initiative, privately deciding that once Urgu's marriage was settled, she'd have no objection to my whole family eventually moving back in, even though I hadn't actually suggested any such thing. Sunshur, meanwhile, could barely hide her amusement, knowing privately that Shueqin's father was actually a notorious troublemaker, drinking, gambling, and otherwise irresponsible, leaving the family's burden mostly on Shueqin herself. Marrying into that family would mean inheriting a difficult father-in-law. Still, she praised Shueqin diplomatically, calling her hardworking and capable, better than many men in the fields. I could tell from her tone that Sunshur wasn't being entirely honest, likely holding something back. Deciding I wouldn't get the full truth here, I stood to leave, saying I needed to think things over before proceeding with any formal proposal. My mother-in-law, confused by my quick departure without ever mentioning moving back in, tried to get me to stay longer, but I insisted I had things to attend to and left. Walking away, I decided I'd need to investigate Shueqin's family myself directly in Hohot village rather than relying on second-hand opinions, since Urgu's happiness deserved a fair, thorough look rather than assumptions based on gossip alone. But that could wait. My priority that afternoon was still the underground water source. I packed up the dried mugwort and headed back into the mountains with my 4 sons. With the village patrol now actively watching, no one from Hohot dared linger near the lotus pond anymore, giving us privacy to work undisturbed. The soil, already baked dry again after just one day of sun exposure, cracked further underfoot. I found a patch that still felt slightly damp and had the boys pile the mugwort there, lighting it with a fire starter. Since mugwort smoke was thick and tended to sink toward moisture, following the smoke's path could reveal exactly where underground water lay hidden. Wherever the smoke suddenly rose upward instead of sinking, water had to be present below. Urgu watched curiously as the smoke drifted downhill toward the valley. We followed it through dense trees until we reached the valley's edge, where a natural gap between 2 mountain ridges created unusually lush vegetation, buzzing with insects. There, the smoke suddenly rose sharply upward. Sania's eyes went wide, spotting water trickling from a crack in the rocks nearby, actual flowing water, even in the middle of this brutal drought. Dashan cupped some in his hands and tasted it, confirming it was sweet, natural spring water. I smiled, relieved the old technique from the book had actually worked. We'd genuinely found an underground water source. Water seeping naturally through solid rock meant there had to be a substantial reserve hidden beneath. Half the battle against this drought was finally won. Water dripped steadily from the rock, seeping back into the ground below. The boys stood amazed, watching the spring in wonder. Urgu couldn't believe how I'd figured out to use mugwort to find water. Rather than admit I'd learned it from a book, I made up a story about a healer using mugwort for dampness back when I lived with my grandmother, claiming I'd simply connected the dots myself, getting lucky with the result. Sidon looked at me with pure admiration, while Dashan celebrated no longer having to worry about drinking water, marveling at how sweet the spring tasted. Saniu eagerly volunteered to fetch water 4 times a day, but I pointed out the math didn't work. With an hour round trip each time, that would eat up most of his day. Finding the water source was only half the job. The real challenge would be figuring out how to actually get this water down to the village. The boys fell into thoughtful silence, unable to think of any solution beyond simply carrying buckets. Then Sidon suddenly spotted something and called out, asking if that was Shueqin over there. Sure enough, I spotted her, surprising, since she'd arrived early that morning and should have gone home hours ago. Beside her stood a village boy named Zhao Shaozhen, blushing furiously in a way that looked eerily similar to how Ergo had acted around her. Ergo's face lit up, and he moved to rush over, but I grabbed his arm, telling him not to interrupt whatever was happening between them. Really, I wanted to observe the situation more closely myself. We stayed hidden in the thick vegetation as the pair approached, unaware we were nearby. Shueqin gently told Shaozhen he didn't need to walk her further, since a nearby path led straight back to Hohot village. He handed her a bag of grain, telling her to come back if she needed more, and she thanked him with a shy, charming smile. Ergo looked completely entranced watching this exchange, missing the obvious implications entirely. I found myself exhausted by how oblivious he was. Clearly, this girl was playing multiple young men at once, and my poor son was just one of several she'd hooked. Sidnan, confused, asked why Shueqin would borrow grain from Shaozhen too when she'd already gotten some from Ergo, innocently noting how pretty her smile looked, assuming it was special just for his brother. I silently praised my youngest for catching on faster than his older brother. Finally, Ergo's dazed expression cleared as he noticed the actual items in Shueqin's hands. The lotus root he'd given her that morning, a basket of foraged vegetables, and now this fresh bag of grain from Shaozhen. He tried desperately to rationalize it, insisting Shueqin was simply a kind, friendly person who made connections easily, suggesting Shaozhen was just helping out of pity for her family's hardship. I gently but firmly pointed out that friends typically didn't hold hands, and right on cue, Shaozhen reached out and took Shueqin's hand, her only reaction a shy smile rather than any resistance. Ergo's eyes went wide with shock. The night before, Shueqin had subtly held his pinky finger too, and he'd assumed it meant something special between them. Furious now, he moved to confront them directly, but I stopped him firmly, reminding him that without a formal proposal or engagement, he had no real claim over her actions, and rushing over now would only make a scene without any standing to back it up. His fists clenched helplessly as he insisted Shueqin wasn't the type to lead him on. I sighed, unable to fully blame him for still hoping, though I privately resented having given away 20 pounds of hard-earned lotus root essentially for nothing. Once Shaozhen finally left, leaving Shueqin alone heading back toward her village, Ergo called out to her. She turned, momentarily glancing around for Shaozhen before relaxing with relief, greeting Ergo with that same practiced, gentle smile that used to melt him completely. This time, though, he asked directly where the bag of grain had come from. She claimed smoothly that an uncle working in our village had sent it along with her. Ergo's heart sank slowly as he realized she was lying to him outright. Struggling to control his anger, he pointed out plainly that he'd just seen Shaozhen hand it to her directly. Her composed smile finally cracked, and she stammered that he must be mistaken. He insisted firmly there was no mistake. He'd recognized Shaozhen from any angle, being from the same village. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes, and she claimed Shaozhen had been pestering her relentlessly, insisting on giving her grain despite her reluctance, only accepting because her family desperately needed it. Seeing her cry instantly dissolved Ergo's anger into guilt, suddenly more concerned with comforting her than confronting her. I sighed for what felt like the 100th time. This girl was far too skilled at manipulation for my poor, smitten son to handle alone. It was clearly time for me to step in directly. I cleared my throat and walked forward, offering to help resolve whatever was troubling her. Shueqin froze completely, clearly not expecting anyone else to be present besides Ergo. Deep in the woods, I stepped out with my other 3 sons following behind. I walked straight up to Shueqin and told her plainly that if Shaozhen had really been forcing grain on her against her will, I'd happily return it to him myself, throwing it right back in his face. I reached for the grain sack, but she gripped it tightly, stammering nervously. I pressed forward, telling her that since Ergo clearly liked her, and she seemed to like him back, we should just settle the engagement properly, promising that once she was officially part of our family, anyone who dared bother her afterward would answer to me directly. Ergo's face flushed red with joy, having already imagined their whole future together down to naming their future children. Shueqin, looking increasingly uncomfortable, asked hesitantly where she'd even live after marrying in, since our house only had 3 rooms. I reassured her cheerfully that I'd already planned for Urgu to build a straw hut extension beside our house, big enough for them and any future children. Her eyes widened in dismay at the idea of a mere hut, clearly having hoped for something better than what she'd left behind. Urgu, meanwhile, was overwhelmed with gratitude, thanking me for being so generous, having never imagined getting his own private space instead of just sleeping in the main room. I continued piling on details, promising that once she joined the family, she wouldn't need to follow strict rules under me, and that with Wu Huanyang pregnant and unable to do heavy chores, all the household work, laundry, cooking, cleaning, would naturally fall to her instead. Shuiqin's expression grew more and more strained. Finally, tears welling up, she blurted out that this was all a misunderstanding. She'd never actually intended to marry into our family at all, insisting she only ever saw Urgu as a brother figure. I couldn't help but be amused at hearing such a classically manipulative excuse even here, in ancient times. Glancing at Urgu, I saw him frozen in disbelief, still somehow clinging to hope even now. I asked her directly whether she'd truly never considered marrying into the Zhao family. She nodded quickly through her tears, insisting again it had all been a misunderstanding. My tone turned cold. I pointed out that Urgu already had plenty of cousins to treat as sisters and didn't need her playing that role, and that if she had no real interest in marrying him, she had no business borrowing grain from our family under false pretenses, especially since it could damage Urgu's reputation. I demanded she return the lotus root too, since I'd only lent it under the assumption she'd actually become part of our family. She stood frozen as I took the root back from her hands, clearly humiliated, silently realizing the village gossip about my sharp tongue hadn't been exaggerated at all. She was relieved now she hadn't actually agreed to marry in, imagining how miserable her life might have become otherwise. I told her firmly that the earlier 10 pounds could stay forgiven, but only because I wanted her to understand clearly that she wasn't welcome back at our house, nor should she continue seeking out Urgu. She should return to her own village and stay there. Fighting back tears, she hurried off without another word, disappearing quickly into the trees toward Ho-Hot village. I turned to look at my sons, half expecting them to be shocked by how firmly I'd handled things, but they seemed remarkably unbothered. I suppose the old me would have handled this far more violently, clawing at the girl's face rather than simply talking her down. By comparison, I'd actually been rather gentle. My eyes landed on Urgu, looking utterly crushed. A young man's first heartbreak had hit him hard and fast. Rather than dwell on it, I gently redirected the conversation, telling him, our family's clever son, to think seriously about how we might channel water down from the mountain. Sidon, not to be outdone, was determined to think of a solution faster than his brother. As we continued foraging, brainstorming ideas together, Sidon excitedly suggested using hollow bamboo stalks connected end to end to carry water down to our house. I praised his cleverness, though pointed out bamboo alone couldn't carry enough water to also irrigate the fields. We needed something bigger to prevent complete crop failure even without rain. Urgu then suggested digging an actual channel or ditch from the mountain valley, letting water flow down naturally. I agreed this matched what I'd already been thinking myself, though pointed out we still needed to calculate the distance involved and how much labor it would take. He walked out several paces, estimating roughly how long a section might take one person to dig, then tried calculating how many workers it would take to dig the entire distance from the mountain to the village, but quickly got stuck, unable to work out the math. I sighed inwardly, realizing this was basic arithmetic any child back home could handle easily, yet here, even bright young men struggled without proper schooling. I decided then that once things settled down here, teaching these boys to read and do basic math would be my very next priority. As the sun began to set, I headed home with my 4 sons. I'd had a good day, gathering several pounds of black bolete mushrooms along the way, my savings hovering steadily around 120 taels. Combined with finally solving the water problem, I felt genuinely good about things. That good mood shattered the moment we got home. Wu Huanyang, pale with shock, told us that an elderly woman named Granny Zhao had essentially starved herself to death. Her family had still had some grain left, but she deliberately refused to eat for 3 days straight, sacrificing herself so her grandson could have more food, dying with a completely empty stomach. Dashan mentioned seeing her recently in the fields, saying she believed the village had angered the gods and would face endless disasters this year, suggesting she may have already given up on living regardless of the cause. I fell quiet, struck by the reality of this. Even someone ready to die had still chosen to starve slowly rather than eat, purely to leave more food for her family's next generation. It was the first time I truly felt the weight of what famine really meant here, casting a shadow over the whole village. My mother-in-law came by before dark, asking Dashan to go pay respects at the wake later, since Granny Zhao had held him as a baby. Then she pulled me aside, mentioning she'd asked around about the Sun family and learned that Shuiqin was actually already close to marrying another villager's son, Shazhen. I explained flatly that I'd misunderstood the situation, and Urga's marriage prospects would need more consideration. She nodded, offering to have a matchmaker look into better options. Just then, Sidon came out with a basket of chopped greens for our 2 hens, proudly explaining to his grandmother that these were the wild hens we'd found on the mountain that laid eggs regularly. She eyed them skeptically, having never seen wild chickens looking exactly like farm-raised ones before, though she reasoned that if anyone in the village had lost such plump hens, word would have spread already. Sidon asked innocently if the eggs might hatch into chicks someday, hoping for an endless supply of eggs. She explained gently that hens needed a rooster for that to happen. Hearing this, I quietly resolved to buy a rooster through my shopping panel next time I was up the mountain, to make our flock seem more believable and productive. I invited my mother-in-law to stay for dinner, but she quickly declined and left, seemingly eager to avoid any appearance of coming just for a free meal. Dinner that night was hearty: mushroom egg soup, vegetable egg pancakes, and hand-pulled noodles, leaving everyone satisfied. Afterward, while there was still light left, I asked Urgu to accompany me to the village elder's house. He understood immediately what I wanted to discuss, and came along without hesitation. Walking through the village in the evening calm, women chatted by their doors, men smoked and talked, children played, until we passed Granny Zhao's house, where a coffin now sat, a somber reminder that as long as the drought continued, more tragedies like hers could easily happen again. At the elder's house, his wife looked surprised to see me, explaining her husband had barely slept the night before and was busy trying to read the sky for signs of rain. Looking up myself, I noted the cloudless sky. No rain was coming tomorrow, that much was certain. Inside, the elder sat with a book about weather patterns, quizzing his grandson Taizhu on unfamiliar characters. It was actually touching seeing an actual book after so many days here, until I realized Taizhu was confidently misteaching him, mixing up characters and completely distorting the meaning of what he was reading. The elder proudly praised the boy's cleverness, unaware of the errors, while Urga looked genuinely envious of Tiezhu's supposed skill. Taizhu even proudly wrote out his own name, accidentally writing the wrong characters entirely without realizing it. I bit back the urge to correct him and refocused on my actual purpose for visiting. I told the elder I had something important to share, the underground water source I discovered in the mountain valley, explaining that if we could channel it down to the rice fields, we might avoid a total crop failure despite the drought. He stood up abruptly, skeptical, given that generations of villagers had lived here without ever finding water in the mountains before. Before I could explain further, someone burst through the door in a panic, shouting that the last working well in the village had suddenly run dry too. Our village had 3 wells originally. 2 had already dried up half a month earlier, leaving just this one final well for the whole village. Now that it too had run dry, wailing broke out across the village. Without water, even eating tree bark and grass wouldn't be enough to survive. The village elder sighed heavily, telling me the entire village's hope now rested on whatever I'd discovered up the mountain. I assured him I never joked about something so serious, then admitted I had a request of my own. He straightened up, relieved. If I did nothing to ask for in return, he might have worried the whole thing was some kind of trick, since disappointment now would be unbearable. I explained that when I'd split off from my husband's family, I'd only received 13 acres of land, most of it poor quality. Before I even finished, he understood and offered me the village's best fertile land instead. I declined, knowing that land belonged to his own family, and instead asked for a stretch of wasteland at the base of the mountain, right in the path where the water would eventually flow, meaning it would eventually become valuable farmland once irrigated. I asked if he'd hold that land for me for 6 months, giving me time to save up enough silver to buy it properly, agreeing he could sell it to someone else if I
couldn't manage it by then.
Given how strained everyone's finances already were after 2 rough years, this wasn't really asking for much. Nobody else had spare money to buy land right now either. He agreed immediately, quoting me the standard wasteland price of 8 silver coins per acre, and asked how many acres I wanted. Not confident in estimating land size accurately, I told him I'd discuss it with my sons first. After we left, his eldest son Onjiang came in questioning his father's judgment, skeptical that water could really exist up there after generations without anyone finding it, suspecting I was just scheming to grab land cheaply. His father defended me, pointing out I'd been honest about the Lotus Root discovery before, and that lying about water for one land deal made little sense when the truth would be obvious the very next day anyway. His wife added that I did seem genuinely different lately, cleaner, healthier, barely recognizable compared to before. On our walk home, we passed the wasteland in question, overgrown and neglected at the mountain's base. Urga tried calculating the total cost aloud, painstakingly working through basic multiplication step by step, struggling with numbers larger than his fingers could count. He eventually resorted to drawing tally marks in the dirt to work out that 30 acres would cost 240 coins total, proud of solving it. I guided him further, explaining that 10 coins equaled 1 tael of silver, helping him work out the total came to 24 taels, a substantial sum given our family's usual
finance.
He grew quiet, realizing how much money that actually represented, then suggested we didn't really need so much land, since our existing farmland was already enough for the family to manage. I told him my plans for the land weren't really about farming, promising to explain once I actually had the silver in hand. Back near the village, crowds gathered anxiously under the old locust tree, debating what to do without any local water source left, the nearest options being either my birth family's village or the rival Hohat village, both over an hour's round trip away, hardly enough to cover daily needs even with constant trips. At home, our water buckets were completely empty, save for half a kettle already boiled. Wu Huanyang nervously offered to borrow water from a neighbor for my washing, worried I might be upset given how particular I'd become about cleanliness lately. I waved it off, telling her one day without bathing wouldn't hurt, especially since she was pregnant and needed rest more than anything. As everyone settled in for the night, I secretly slipped a couple of eggs from my shopping panel into the hen's coop before finally going to sleep myself. The next morning, Seiden's excited voice rang through the yard, announcing that our 2 hens, which he'd named Big Yellow and Second Yellow after a full night of deliberation, had laid 4 eggs between them. The names weren't particularly creative, but then again, none of these boys' naming choices ever were. Our village had officially run out of water. Before dawn, someone had already made a trip to the Chung family's village and returned with 2 buckets, though the price they'd paid was outrageous, a whole pound of grain just for 1 bucket of water. People grumbled that Hohat village was even worse, demanding 3 pounds of grain per bucket. Everyone understood that skipping food for a day was survivable, but going without water in this brutal summer heat could actually kill people. When the village elder arrived, everyone turned to him hopefully, trusting he'd have a plan. He addressed the crowd solemnly, pointing out the harsh math. Trading grain for water from neighboring villages would mean feeding them while starving our own people, just like Granny Zhao who'd starved herself the day before. Panic rippled through the crowd, especially given how fresh that tragedy still felt. Now, without water too, even more deaths seemed inevitable. An elderly woman began wailing, questioning why heaven would punish such a hard-working village. The elder raised his voice, insisting heaven wouldn't be so cruel, that there had to be a way through this. Privately, he'd already connected the dots. Since wildlife and plants still thrived up in the mountains, there had to be water up there, giving real weight to what I'd told him the night before. He announced that going a single day without water wouldn't kill anyone and promised an answer by sunset, deliberately staying vague until the water source could be confirmed. I met him at the base of the mountain along with my sons, joined by his own sons Onjiang and Anha, and his promising grandson Taiju. The boys immediately fell into playful banter, with Sanya asking Taiju to teach him to write his name. Taiju managed Sanya's name easily enough, but got stuck trying to write egg for Saiden's name, forgetting the exact character, and quickly changed the subject by pointing out clouds in the sky, wondering aloud if rain might finally be coming. Everyone looked up hopefully, but I could tell those clouds weren't a real sign of rain. The elder, drawing on decades of farming experience, confirmed it would likely be another dry, sunny day. Taiju, confused, insisted his book said rising clouds meant rain was coming, unable to reconcile the conflicting information, not realizing he'd simply misread the character earlier, confusing high with thick. I stayed quiet, understanding the deeper problem. This village had never produced an actual scholar, unlike the Chung family's village, which had an old retired official running a small school. Without proper education nearby, sending children to study in town cost real money, explaining why my birth family had squeezed so much money out of me over the years to fund my nephew's schooling. After about an hour's walk, we reached the valley between the two mountain peaks. Cool, refreshing mist drifted through the air even before we arrived. Anjiang rushed forward and, upon seeing water actually seeping from the rock face, became overwhelmed with excitement, amazed no one had ever discovered this before. The elder trembled, realizing that without my discovery, the village might have lost half its population this year alone. Anha grabbed a shovel and dug into the ground, quickly uncovering a small spring that gushed up fresh water, letting everyone drink their fill. Anjiang apologized sincerely for doubting me earlier, admitting he'd assumed I was scheming to trick his father. I brushed off the apology, focusing instead on the real challenge, getting this water down to irrigate the rice fields before it was too late. The elder calculated that with the drought delaying growth, most of the crops were only just now flowering, right when they desperately needed water, meaning time was critical. But the distance between the source and the fields was enormous, over 10 miles, far too much to manage by manual labor alone within any reasonable time frame. He turned to me, puffing his pipe thoughtfully, asking if I had any ideas. I gestured to Urgu, encouraging him to share the plan he'd worked out the day before. He explained enthusiastically that with over 1,000 acres of rice fields needing water, hand-carrying buckets wouldn't work. Instead, we should dig a channel directly from the mountains spring down to the fields, letting gravity do the work. Before he could finish, Anha shook his head doubtfully, pointing out the sheer distance involved, over 10 or 20 miles, longer even than typical flood control embankments.